Do it.
Do it!
Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
Hello there, before we move along with the video, I would like to bring something important to your attention. However, if this is your first time watching this video, this doesn't really concern you, so skip to this timestamp if you wish. But you're welcome to sit the whole way through. After all, if you clicked on a nearly 3-hour video, I'd assume you have enough time for this short disclaimer. For the rest of you returning viewers, however, yes, this is a re-upload, and let me explain to you why that is. See, when you publish a video, whether it took you a day, a week, a month, or a year of your time to finish it, it's not as simple as clicking the upload button, and that's all there is to it. In some cases, your video gets blocked or claimed by copyright, and you have to edit the video and try again, until the algorithm and copyright bots will leave you alone. I'd like to point to my Mulan video, a video that I had to edit and re-upload 25 times before Disney would leave it, and my audience could see it. So that's what we call a copyright block. It's annoying, but it's fixable. Now I'd like to point to this video. As you can see, it's done quite well in terms of a view count. Easily one of my best performing videos, to this day. Would it surprise you to know that I didn't make $1 single off it? Yeah, pretty annoying, that. That's because it was immediately copyright claimed, and because Universal is the worst company in entertainment today, the dispute was rejected, despite the video being completely fair use. But despite all of this, I wasn't as angry as you might think, despite losing thousands of dollars, due to an extremely flawed system, because as you can see, I gained about 2,400 subscribers, and many of those lovely individuals are still with me to this day. The point I'm trying to get at is that the video itself did very well. I gained supporters, and as many people were able to see the video as possible, so I was still quite proud of it. But now we come to this very video, the one that you are watching. And how is this different? Well, this video passed the copyright test, it wasn't blocked, and it wasn't claimed. In no small part due to some very thorough editing. You see, this is the test that every video goes through before being published. This means it's been copyrighted. This means the video, for whatever reason, is not advertiser friendly, which is a capital middle finger from YouTube themselves, and is actually worse than a copyright claim for reasons I'll explain in a second. And then there's this, which means there's nothing wrong with the video, it hasn't been copyright claimed, it's advertiser friendly, it's all systems go. So, what happened? Well, when I originally published this video, this is what the status was. It passed every test. By YouTube's own algorithm, the video was completely fine, absolutely nothing wrong with it. Less than a fortnight later, I check my videos and their statuses, and I see that this video has gone from this to this. Without being notified, some jerk-off pencil-pushing twat from YouTube went into my video and deemed it not advertiser-friendly. Normally, a YouTube representative only does this kind of review when the content creator submits an appeal because the algorithm deemed the video not suitable for advertisers. But as I previously mentioned, I submitted no such appeal because by YouTube's own metric, the video was advertiser friendly, according to their own algorithm. And the only reason you are seeing this video right now, again, is because YouTube's algorithm has once again deemed this video to be advertiser friendly. So why oh why was YouTube poking around, dumping on my channel to begin with? Very curious, I know. But here's the kicker. Want to know why that particular spineless representative deemed the video not suitable for advertisers? Well, let me show you. This here is the reason. This is what you're looking at. Discussions of modern acts of terror, events resulting in the catastrophic loss of human life, or controversial social issues. Wow. Just wow. That's the reason. In a video that's about Star Wars, for God's sake. That's what the video was flagged for. Now, let me tell you why this is actually, in many ways, worse than a copyright claim. Not only does it cut off 99% of your video's revenue, and no, I'm not exaggerating, but unlike a copyright claim, some big corporation like Zephyr Universal isn't making money off your video. See, that's why that video still did so well in terms of a view count. Because YouTube was still making money. But in this case, the case of demonetization, no one is making money. YouTube doesn't want to make money off it. And so YouTube has nothing to gain by recommending it. So what this does is it essentially turns the video into a paperweight because nobody sees it unless they explicitly look for it because it's not recommended. It has its momentum completely halted because YouTube can't make money, so why should you?
Apart from everything I've talked about, YouTube has actually lied about how much this yellow dollar sign affects the video itself. They have said before that it doesn't change the views or affect its recommendations, but if you look at the stats again, that's blatantly not true. Check out my KOTOR video. The sudden drop in revenue and views isn't a coincidence. It's incredibly stressful when I put out a new video and it's doing really well, making me feel good, and then all of a sudden, poof, views come crashing down to the ground, I'm not making any money off of it, and it's demoralizing.
Now, I spoke to YouTube, as it turns out, and I said, fix this. Their response was the following. Some pencil neck weasel says this. Our expert team looked at it, and while it's true it was wrongfully flagged for the category listed, we're still going to keep it demonetized because there was a bunch of swear words in there, so we still don't think it's advertiser friendly. So in other words, YouTube told me to screw myself. I responded, in kind, by saying, fine, here's my account number. Can I have a month of your salary because that's how long it took me to make this video, and I'm not going to put up with your bureaucratic, overly sensitive, politically agenda-driven nonsense. Your own algorithm cleared my video, and you're keeping it demonetized due to a technicality to cover your ass. Piss off. And that's the whole story. That's why I re-uploaded this video. Because guess what? The algorithm has cleared it once again, just like it did the first time. And if YouTube meddles again, I'm just going to keep re-uploading. Because this video was perfectly fine the way it was, and nobody on this platform should have to put up with this. But now I want to do something I usually say for the end of my videos. If you like what I do and would like to support me, given that at the moment this is my primary source of income, please consider donating to me on Patreon. I'd imagine most of you by now know what Patreon is and why it exists. Well, this is why. This whole ordeal is why people like me have a Patreon. It keeps us working hard, keeps us afloat, it keeps this viable for us to do. Because at any time, someone from YouTube, just because they feel like ruining your day, can waltz into your channel and mess everything up. And like I said, this video took a month to make, and it was not easy. I can tell you that. So please, consider supporting the channel on Patreon if you enjoy what I do. And if Patreon isn't your thing, there's YouTube memberships. You can click the bell icon to receive video notifications straight away. You can recommend these videos to your friends. You could hit the like button. All of that is greatly appreciated as well, and it helps me out a great deal. Now, I'm sorry for taking up your time with this sob story crap. Let's begin the video, shall we? Thanks for taking the time.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 reasons why the Star Wars prequels suck. For the top 10 reasons why the Star Wars prequels suck. For the top 10 reasons why the Star Wars prequels suck.
For the top 10 reasons why the Star Wars prequels suck.
What orders from Mordor, my lord? What does the Eye command?
We have work to do.
I couldn't believe some of the things they wrote about the prequels, you know? I mean, but really, beyond, I didn't like it. You ruined my childhood, and I'm still angry about the way they treated Jake Lloyd. He was only 10 years old, that boy, and he did exactly what George wanted him to do. Believe me, I understand clunky dialogue. So I almost got hornswoggled in that documentary where they weren't calling it The People versus George Lucas at the time, but I could tell from the questions they were asking me, it was an open invitation to trash George.
George Lucas raped our childhood. 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 George Lucas raped our childhood.
And I have issues with George, but I love that man.
You go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized, and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. You know, it's not much fun, and you can't experiment. You can't do anything. You have to do it a certain way. I don't like that. I never did. I started out in experimental films, and I want to go back to experimental films. But of course, nobody wants to see experimental films.
The main thing is to protect these characters. Make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them.
I'm curious that the Force doesn't get muddled into a bunch of garbledygook.
Can I just say, though, a lot of times I would say to Ryan, we got to think about the fans. And he said, no, we got to think about the story, and we got to think about our movie, which
Welcome back to Revenge of the Prequels, everyone. I'm sorry I've been away from this for a while, but we are back and we are ready to go. But before we begin, I want to stress something important to you as viewers. As you can see, this is quite long in length, and I won't know for sure until after recording this, but this might be my longest video to date.
It's alive!
And there's a lot I have to say this time around. Whether you're new to the series or have been following along for a long time now, I'd really appreciate you staying till the very end. Even if you got to pause multiple times, there's a few things I've been meaning to say and some points I've wanted to make for a long time now. And these are littered throughout the entirety of this video, but particularly towards the end, which is why it's important for you to keep watching until the video is finished. So thanks for clicking on the video, thanks for coming back to the channel, and I hope you enjoy. Now today we return to the mainstream internet bandwagon riding passionless and out of touch trash fire that is WatchMojo. This went swimmingly last time. Matter of fact, that episode was by far the most watched episode in this series. Much to my own surprise, in fact. And even more to my shock, the response video from a channel with less than 40,000 subscribers actually got more views than the original video by a channel with over 20 million subscribers. So I think it's safe to say we are getting somewhere, and I appreciate the feedback and encouragement from all of you who enjoy this series. Thank you. And yes, for those of you who are new, this is a series, in fact. There is currently 14 other videos that go along with this one, making this the 15th. Yeah, it's hard for me to believe as well. So let me explain what this series is about in a nutshell. And let me be crystal clear about it so I don't get people strawmanning me, as I'm quite sick to death of it at this point. Regarding my series, I don't think the prequels are masterpieces by any stretch of the imagination. I simply know that they are objectively good films, and I'm sick and tired of the internet bullshit levied against them. Arguments based simply on ignorance, or just plain stupidity, and most damnably a clear, biased internet agenda, or in the case of WatchMojo, all of the above. The flaws of the prequels do exist, it's just the majority of arguments levied against the prequels simply don't hold up under a lens, as I hope I've adequately showcased with the previous videos I've made in this series, which have gradually become more informative and accurate over time. Hell, the previous 5 episodes I made were in response to one very moronic video, and collectively was over 2.5 hours of criticism. So I hope you, the audience, gained something from all of that, because it was a nightmare for me to put together. Another important point I need to make clear is Revenge of the Prequels is a rage-fueled response series designed to counter terrible arguments against the prequels, but please know the difference between insults and arguments. Try not to conflate the two. The insults are there to mirror the person I am responding to, depending on who that may be. Some episodes of this series have been more civil than others. No content creator is exempt from this series, it just depends on the quality of their argumentation. I've covered content creators of all channel sizes, and none of it has been personal. Each person has simply been another name on the list. Now regarding WatchMojo, the first video I covered was called 5 Reasons Why Star Wars Has Surpassed George Lucas. Yeah, that was a dumpster fire, so let's take a look at this next one I'll be covering. The sequel, we shall call it. The top 10 reasons why people hate the Star Wars prequels. Well, I mean, with 20 million subscribers, one would think that they know exactly what they're talking about, right? Nope!
I love democracy.
Over 30,000 dislikes, which is a landslide compared to the 4,000 people who said that this video was good. What's even more telling is that with 20 million subs, I figured getting 30,000 dislikes wouldn't be too difficult if you talk about a heavily debated topic, especially with that much of a following. But it's the ratio that's just so damn satisfying to behold. Which reminds me of a quote someone else made regarding the prequels.
A certain online critic deconstructed the prequels, explained in reasonable terms why most people hate them. Why most people hate them. Why most people hate them.
Yeah, so you can forget about trying to pass off that narrative. The reason why this is such an accurate representation of how people actually feel about the prequels, at least at surface level, is because the WatchMojo audience isn't a massive anti-George Lucas circle jerk of shit. Nor is it a group of people who are prequel apologists. 20 million subscribers is large enough to account for the general consensus of just plain old regular people. So you can take the...
And while there are fans of the prequels out there, I think the majority of us can agree they were very disappointing movies.
And kindly stick it up your ass, mate. So let us go on this journey together, you and I, and dissect just how terrible this video is. Let us crawl through this river of shit and try to come out clean on the other side.
Shall we?
These films proved that even something as great as Star Wars can turn to the dark side.
Ah yes, the classic WatchMojo intro that talks as if the narrator actually knows anything about the topic of the day or gives half a shit about it. And so they'll just Wikipedia the common gripes from whichever bandwagon they are trying to pander to.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 reasons why the Star Wars prequels suck.
First off, hatred is a subjective term, which is what you used in the title of this video. Secondly, the word suck implies a degree of objectivity in your statement, so which is it? You may want to distinguish between the two. But hey, this is WatchMojo, right? They only care as far as the topic's popularity can make them $1. You can hate something that's good, and you can love something that's shit. For example, I'm not fond of Goodfellas, despite it being my sister's favourite movie, and universally praised by all the Scorsese fans out there. It's a great movie, but I personally just don't like it. Transformers 4 is a roaring dumpster fire, but I still really enjoy it. I have no idea why I enjoy that movie. And yes, I know I am an anomaly. But do you see how that works? So if you're gonna say the Star Wars prequels suck, you better have some damn good arguments.
Before we begin, we've got something big in the works, so be sure to tune in to WatchMojo Live on May 31st for special musical performances and much more. For this list, we'll be looking at all the reasons Star Wars fans tend to dislike the prequel trilogy, and analyzing the factors that earned the prequels their less than interstellar reputation.
It's a go.
Seems odd to me that you would show that clip to reflect that statement. Padme just named her daughter after giving birth. So you've honestly got me at a loss with this one. I have no idea what you're trying to convey.
Number 10. Bad acting.
I have seen a security hologram of him killing younglings.
Acting can make or break a film.
Yes, it can. So why did you use the clip of Obi-Wan explaining to Padme how in this sci-fi universe he found out his apprentice he considered a brother committed mass child murder? Sure, it could have been written a little more eloquently, but the situation demanded Obi-Wan be absolutely crystal clear to Padme that the accusations against Anakin that he was making weren't accusations at all. He was simply oblivious that Anakin was the father of her unborn baby.
Anakin is the father, isn't he? I'm so sorry.
Otherwise, perhaps he would have spared her the details. I don't see how that's badly acted, but I'll let you elaborate before I explain why some of the acting is a little unorthodox.
And unfortunately for the prequels, it was the latter. Natalie Portman was more wooden than her talent should allow, and later admitted that the films actually cost her work.
Anakin, you're breaking my heart.
Well, that is unfortunate, and yes, I did some research and that can be verified as true, but Natalie Portman is a terrific actress. She's been in tons of critically and audience-acclaimed roles since then, which proves that she is a great actress, and she always was. However, the prequels are heavily misunderstood for their acting and directing. George Lucas has gone on record that he specifically chose a more olden-style 1930s method of directing his actors, which the modern audience would be unfamiliar with. He also went on to say that method acting became popular in the 50s. He's fully aware of how that style works and translates to the performances on screen, but he simply prefers the older style. Now that's me paraphrasing. We are going to come back to this soon. But the most obvious gripe people tend to have with the acting is the romance between Anakin and Padme and the on-set chemistry of Hayden and Natalie. I'll say right now, it's not perfect, but the acting choices and directing involved was made with purpose and style in mind.
When George first began to speak to me about episode 2, and George said to me, why don't you make a love theme? It's like the old Hollywood movies. It's introduced gradually when the lovers are reunited, not as lovers, but as acquaintances.
Not to mention, the lines spoken are meant to fall in line with who these characters are as people. their prior development as human beings in a sci-fi galaxy far, far away. One being a slave boy who grew up having love and affection for only two people, those being his mother and Padme herself, and then being thrown into a socially and romantically isolated role of a warrior monk where duty comes first. The other being a young girl who has grown up in public service her whole life, being the youngest queen ever elected, and then moving straight into the political realm to become one of the Republic's fiercest idealists. Rarely does she ever get the chance to indulge in selfish pursuits, or just behave like a regular woman, or girl for that matter. One of the only times she's able to do this was back in The Phantom Menace on Tatooine with Anakin himself, and it's one of the reasons she's drawn to him in Attack of the Clones, after they're reunited after 10 years. Now, the romance is heavily misunderstood. We will cover that later, even though we've covered that on several other videos already. But the style of which George used to portray it, as well as the rest of the film itself, is very unorthodox, and I think it needs more attention brought to it, because it goes over many people's heads, including my own, until I did my own research. And furthermore, at the time of release, much of the audience and directors included would have very easily misinterpreted Natalie's portrayal of Padme as a wooden or at times overly melodramatic individual, when her character at her core isn't used to opening up her feelings, because she is always at the forefront of the political realm. This is the center of her arc in Attack of the Clones, and it leads quite nicely into Revenge of the Sith with all of her emotions coming to a head. But George wanted to film it in a style to be consistent with how older cinematic romances have often been portrayed in the past. So those directors who didn't want to work with Natalie Portman just did what a lot of other people in the audience did, which was make sweeping judgments at face value about the actors and the characters they were portraying. And judging by the general reception these movies have had by supposedly credible online critics, I wouldn't be surprised if the directors in question weren't paying attention to the subtleties in Padme's character, Natalie's acting, and George's chosen style. You could argue that there was a lack of moderation with this style, which led to somewhat of a disconnect at times, but to slap the label of bad acting on it is just to be willingly ignorant. Never once did those directors ask themselves, why did George choose this take? Why did he tell them to portray the scene like that? Why is Natalie choosing to emote like that, or not at all? Anyway, the whole bad acting and actors argument isn't really much of an argument anymore, since Natalie Portman has shined brilliantly for the most part since the prequels. She said verbatim those directors thought she was a terrible actress. Well, it shows what the fuck they knew, and if nothing else, they were blind too if they couldn't spot this incredible talent right here. Also, here's a side note that certainly doesn't get enough praise. Pretty much all of the actors in the prequels did their own stunts, save for a few death-defying moments. And of course, Christopher Lee's old age.
George Lucas, Star Wars. I did do the fight with Yoda.
But George Lucas certainly had a knack for choosing great physical actors who had tremendous enthusiasm for the product, enough to put themselves in harm's way. Now, regarding George's style for directing and how he has the actors portray the characters, again, I'll get back into that in a few moments because this ignorant twat isn't done with her checkbox just yet. But there's honestly a lot more to say on the matter, and truthfully, I don't know if I'm the right person to explain it, since my knowledge of both filmmaking and film history is very limited, to say the least. And let's be perfectly clear, so is 99% of YouTube. But I will happily point the finger at the self-proclaimed critics on the internet who do claim to have this knowledge, and especially the directors who criticized Natalie Portman at the time of release for not realizing that she was portraying the character as instructed, due to the style George has chosen, which they, as film buffs, should have known about, since they claim to be the experts. Anyway, let's move on.
Samuel L. Jackson seems disinterested at best.
Well, actually no, he's just playing the role as he's meant to. Mace Windu isn't the most lively of characters, but he has his moments to not only shine, but also leave an impact and leave us questioning the character's morality.
While the child actors Daniel Logan and Jake Lloyd received more than their share of criticism.
Yeah, and those criticisms were garbage. I'm sorry, but the only reason, and quote me on this, feel free, the only reason they were criticized as heavily as they were is because one was playing the young Darth Vader and the other was playing the young Boba Fett. One being the most popular and at the time misunderstood supervillain of all time, since George Lucas always wanted Darth Vader to be a tragic character, not some all-powerful warlord.
Everybody thought of Darth Vader as this big evil guy that, had no heart. He was just evil. But in the end, it's not that at all. And here's a guy who has lost everything.
and the other being a glorified paperweight wearing a bucket that fans blew way out of proportion. I know I'm sounding very uncharitable here, but that's because I'm sick of the bullshit. And those people know exactly who they are. And I don't want to hear the, oh, but there are many good child actors argument as some kind of smokescreen to sidestep the issue. One of my favorite child actors in recent years is Daphne Keane from Logan. One of the best performances from a child actress in recent years, easily. Her performance was captivating and heart-wrenching and at times terrifying.
What? People hurt me. I've hurt people too.
Humor me here, but what does Laura from Logan have that's different from Anakin Skywalker in The Phantom Menace? Well, for starters, Laura is an unhinged, mutated killing machine who's had an extremely violent and tragic past, and who more than anything wants to connect with her estranged father. That's the character Daphne Keane was told to play, and she did it perfectly. Jake Lloyd was asked to portray a hopeful, naive, kind-hearted slave boy who wanted to venture out into the stars.
There's so many. Do they all have a system of planets? Has anyone been to them all?
Not likely.
I want to be the first one to see them all.
And here's probably the most important detail. Like Laura, Anakin is 9 fucking years old, and he cleans engines all goddamn day. If he sees a girl like Natalie fucking Portman walk into his shop one day, when he probably hardly sees any female teenagers of his species walk into a spare parts shop, then he might say something childish and awkward. That doesn't make Jake Lloyd a bad actor, and it doesn't make the dialogue terrible either. He's simply fulfilling the role he needed to. And that's not to say I don't have a couple of criticisms of my own regarding Anakin's portrayal in The Phantom Menace, but when Anakin says this...
Are you an angel?
What?
An angel. I heard the deep space pilots talk about them. They're the most beautiful creatures. They live on the moons of Viego, I think.
You're a funny little boy.
That falls perfectly in line with his character as a naive 9-year-old. Kids say silly things all the time. They say things that one could perceive to be awkward and cringy if spoken by an adult, but that's part of why it's endearing hearing it from a child, because they don't know any better when they say those things.
Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina.
Thanks for the tip.
And this is why Padme finds this both flattering and amusing that a younger kid would say that to her so boldly and enthusiastically. Because even though he's sadly mistaken, she knows it comes from a wholesome place. This one remark also tells us a lot about Anakin's character, and the dynamic you see here between these two characters exhibited in their first scene feeds nicely into Attack of the Clones. As for Boba Fett, all I care to say is anyone who had a problem with the 3 or so lines this child actor had can go straight to hell. Fuck them. I have no sympathy or remorse for those people. There's way more important things to discuss.
But Hayden Christensen is perhaps the worst offender. While he didn't exactly have the strongest writing to work with, other actors were able to overcome it.
I don't like sand.
Okay, internet, take notes. Using the sand quote out of context is possibly the most played out and weightless fucking argument you could make against the prequels. And if you want to use that narrow scope, you bet your ass the oh so precious original trilogy isn't excluded from the broad stroke of bad acting and dialogue either.
Scruffy looking nerf herder.
Who's scruffy looking?
You'll find that the sand quote in full context makes plenty of sense given where Anakin comes from. Not to mention, but 5 fucking seconds ago, you see Padme saying this.
I love the water. I love the water.
I love the water.
I don't like sand.
We would swim to that island every day. I love the water. We used to lie out on the sand and let the sun dry us.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. Not like here.
It's funny how you don't see people referencing that. Now, in regards to Hayden Christensen, you'll find he's been universally praised for being an excellent visual actor. Given that Star Wars was always meant to play out like silent films, it's no wonder George chose him.
You look at those eyes, and there's just so much happening there. Hayden had all the elements of the character.
Regardless, most of the criticism surrounding Hayden Christensen's acting comes down to him portraying a very whiny character, when in actuality that's a core character trait of Anakin Skywalker. especially in Attack of the Clones. His immaturity and rebellious nature, like a teen looking to break free from his boundaries.
In some ways, a lot of ways, I'm really ahead of him. I'm ready for the trials, but he feels that I'm too unpredictable. He won't let me move on. It's all Obi-Wan's fault. He's jealous. He's holding me back.
Hayden Christensen walked into Star Wars wanting to play the young Darth Vader. George told him, "You're not going to play the young Darth Vader, you're going to be playing a petulant teenager." And that's exactly what was portrayed on screen. I'm not saying there aren't instances of poor delivery during his performance, and a flawless performance isn't easy to come by, but he fulfilled his role really well for what he needed to do.
Christensen had the weight of the prequels on his shoulders, and was ultimately unable to rise to the occasion, to the disappointment of many.
Why the hell would you show arguably Hayden Christensen's best delivered line while you're trying to discredit his acting ability? For reference, Hayden has acted very well as an angsty troubled teen in other media. Most applicable to the discussion is a Canadian television show he starred in called Higher Ground.
I am not shitting you.
Now let me preface this by saying I have no attachment to this show whatsoever. I don't even know what it's about, but that's besides the point. I came across this footage by YouTube recommendeds, believe it or not. I never sought it out, and I doubt I ever would have found it otherwise. Anyway, in this show, Hayden portrays another troubled teen. Obviously, this character is very much different to Anakin Skywalker, but they share some core tendencies as troubled youths. I'm gonna play a small snippet for you out of context just to show you what I mean.
Your head. We're not leaving. You can't stay here, so talk to me.
Talk about what? There's nothing to talk about.
It's me or the cops. I'm the easy way out here.
I'm not going anywhere with anybody. I just want to be left alone.
I know. But that's not going to happen. So come on. Give me a chance. Maybe I can help you. Talk to me. Tell me what it is.
I can't go home. Don't send me home.
What's happening at home, Scott?
Nothing. Just leave me alone. No, why are you asking me these kinds of questions?
Documented proof. It would help your case.
No. The answer is no. She just went after me. What's the word? I betrayed him. And that was the worst of it. What I did to him in my heart. And she just kept after me.
Scott, women are not the only victims of sexual abuse. It can happen to boys and men as well.
So what happens now? I killed them. I killed them all. They're dead. Every single one of them. And not just the men, but the women. And the children, too. And I slaughtered them like animals. I hate them. I'm a Jedi. I know I'm better than this.
Now, after observing that, not only can we conclude that Hayden Christensen can act, but we can also conclude he wasn't miscast for Anakin Skywalker. And knowing this, in addition with his visual acting capability, he actually seems like the ideal choice to play the role of Anakin. So what's different in regards to how he portrays Anakin as a troubled youth, as opposed to this ordinary troubled teen from the Canadian soap opera? And let's, for argument's sake, invalidate the fact that Anakin comes from a completely different universe, the story takes place under completely different circumstances, and the character of Anakin had a completely different upbringing. What's different between the two portrayals? The style. Not just the acting, but the directing as well. And here is where I bring up this quote from George Lucas. Now, admittedly, I have not been able to track down the origins of this quote, so feel free to take this with a grain of salt. I would have mentioned this while we were covering Natalie, but I wanted to wait until we cover Hayden as well. The quote goes as follows. "It's not deliberately camp. I made Attack of the Clones in a 1930s style based on a Saturday matinee serial from the 1930s, so the acting style is very 30s, very theatrical, very old-fashioned. Method acting came in the 1950s and is very predominant today. I prefer to use the old style. People take it different ways depending on their sophistication." George Lucas. Now again, grain of salt, but as further evidence to back this quote up, George also wanted Hayden for the role of a teenage Anakin Skywalker because he wanted the portrayal to be reminiscent of James Dean. an American actor born in the 1930s who tragically died very young in the 50s. And if you look at the film Rebel Without a Cause, where Dean plays a troubled, angsty high school teenager, you can certainly perceive some of the seeds for Anakin Skywalker in Attack of the Clones.
They think that they can protect me by moving around all the time. What do you mean? Mess a kid up?
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing, I don't ever want to be like him. I bet you see right through me, don't you?
What was it like working with, again, because it was a beginning for all of you, what was it like working with young Harrison Ford?
Oh my gosh. Well, the thing is, he walked on. George likes to cast people that are so close to what he wants, he doesn't have to really get in there and give you a lot of direction.
Yeah.
Heard hundreds of us in, and I guess it was sort of pared down, and I ended up doing a reading on camera with Harrison.
Our only hope in destroying it is to find its weakness, which we will determine from the data I stored in R2.
I cast a film, first of all, trying to get the best actors possible. Second of all, given that criteria, I look for people who kind of, in their own personality and their own physical presence, embody what I envision the character to be. So I'm looking for actors who, in their lives and what they are, have some kind of resonance with the characters. Whenever you're casting, first of all, you're always looking for a really good actor, somebody that really has a lot of craft and is really very talented. Action! Who fits the part that you've created. In case I was looking for somebody who was very boyish and young, but had sort of a James Dean, sullen edge to him.
You may not agree with everything I've brought to the table in this video, but good luck getting this kind of insight with what shitty critics or websites like WatchMojo tend to regurgitate all over YouTube, or what you originally perceived the prequels to be at face value, as opposed to what they actually are. I think I've outlined much to be explored at the very least regarding the acting and style in the prequels. Hopefully I've at least proved to you that it isn't so black and white, and it's here that I'm going to end my discussion on the matter. The reason being, I'm simply not educated enough on filmmaking and film history, as previously stated, to go very in-depth on the subject, without making a fool of myself. With that said, there is a very insightful video that does discuss the filmmaking of the prequels and its inspirations very well. It's done by a guy called Rick Worley. It's 2 hours long, and it's called How to Watch Star Wars, Part 1, Why the Prequels Are Better Movies Than You Deserve. Now, I know what you were thinking, and I thought the same thing regarding the title. Don't be discouraged. The title is meant in the more literal sense, for certain decisions that were made for the filming and acting in the prequels. And as a matter of fact, this video is applicable to all of Star Wars. The latter half of the title is directed at the previous reviewers, we'll call them, of the prequels, who have been very ignorant and incompetent while discussing the prequels in the past. Seriously, do yourself a favor and watch that video. If you haven't learned at least 5 new things about the prequels and George Lucas by the very end of the runtime,
You won't have to terminate me. I'll quit.
Anyway, let's get back to WatchMojo.
Number 9. Weak romance scenes.
What's bothering you?
Nothing.
Again, why would you show that of all scenes? And of course you'd cut it right before Anakin brings up the Japor snippet that he gave her as a memento of affection from all the way back in episode 1. But yeah, go on, what were you saying about weak romance?
Even amid all the lightsaber battles and lost limbs, the original trilogy featured one of the best big screen romances ever. The prequels attempted to recapture the magic with Padme and Anakin, but failed miserably.
Honestly, I think the romance between Han and Leia is significantly overblown, almost to spite the prequels by certain fans and certain companies with agendas, if this video is anything to go by. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad romance. I just think it's average, especially by today's standards. The relationship can be summed up as princess with a taste for bad boys meets a bad boy who has a softer side. I found it reasonably interesting in The Empire Strikes Back, and in Return of the Jedi, I found it very run-of-the-mill and boring. Yes, I know, this is a subjective point. The reason I prefer the prequels is because of the depth the prequels provide in terms of its storytelling, its world building, its lore, and its characters. Anakin and Padme's developing relationship and romance is very much a part of that, which I've already gone into several times in this very video and in this video series.
This romance feels incredibly forced right from the start, when child Anakin awkwardly asks Padme if she's an angel.
Are you an angel?
What?
An angel.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I already covered this, but I find it's interesting you use the term awkward to describe their first meeting. when part of the reason it's so charming is because Anakin doesn't realize he's being awkward. He has no self-awareness for how he comes off here. Anakin and Padme's dynamic does become awkward in Attack of the Clones by design because while their foundation is very wholesome and innocent, in Attack of the Clones they are both older and there's a degree of tension between them when they are reintroduced to each other and placed into a scenario that renders them both a fish out of water.
When he first sees Padme, his attraction changes from when we first saw their relationship and how it left. It was a much more childlike affection.
Annie? My goodness, you've grown.
So have you. Grown more beautiful, I mean. Well, for a senator, I mean.
Annie, you'll always be that little boy I knew on Tatooine.
Padme just thought of him as a little kid. So it's Padme adjusting to the fact that he's now a grown-up guy.
And all of a sudden he comes back and she's like, wow, he's grown up into this handsome young Hayden Christensen. So their relationship really goes from this sort of her looking down on this younger guy to him sort of proving himself as a real force.
Having both been emotionally closed off for so long, they slowly bring out each other's softer side.
Fast forward to the second film, where Anakin grows more serial killer-like and stalks her, to the point where Padme even claims that she feels uncomfortable.
Please don't look at me like that.
Why not?
It makes me feel uncomfortable.
Anakin stalks her. He's her fucking bodyguard, you absolute airhead. What executive did you stalk to get that fucking job of yours, I wonder? Also, regarding Anakin's face and how he comes off to Padme in this particular instance, like I said, he has very little self-awareness of how he comes off. Ever since the first scene he's reintroduced to her, and also since he's completely romantically illiterate. However, in addition to that, and this is the part people sleep on, when Padme says,
Please don't look at me like that. It makes me feel uncomfortable.
Well, why is she feeling uncomfortable? Is it because Anakin is a creeper? I'm pretty sure if she thought he was a creeper, she wouldn't have ended up with the guy. Not to mention, we know that Padme has had an attraction to Anakin since the moment he was reintroduced to her.
I've been dying a little bit each day since you came back into my life.
So why, when he's looking at her lustfully, and admittedly coming on a little strong for reasons I've mentioned previously, why does she say, I feel uncomfortable? We know it's not because she's not attracted to Anakin, or because he freaks her out, so what could it be? Not to mention what we later know about how she hasn't had so much as a crush on another person since she was 12.
Alright. I was 12. His name was Paulo. We were both in the legislative youth program. He was a few years older than I. Very cute. Dark curly hair, dreamy eyes.
Alright, I get the picture.
What could it be, I wonder? I'm sure you can see what I'm getting at here. It's staring you right in the face. She tells Anakin to not look at her like that because it's making her feel uncomfortable because she likes it.
I know, right?
And she doesn't like that she likes it. She feels uncomfortable because she's not used to feeling this way. She's not used to indulging in selfish feelings, romantic feelings, being a normal woman who's free to follow her heart because she's been in the role of public service her whole life.
It's really a struggle for her to say, can I be selfish and fall in love myself when I have all these aspirations and all these things I need to accomplish?
And once more has been extremely ambitious in that role as an idealist, trying to effect change, or rather prevent change. And in comes this blast from the past, who was the last person to ever make her feel like she could be herself.
Are you an angel?
What?
An angel. They're the most beautiful creatures in the universe.
You're a funny little boy.
Annie? My goodness, you've grown.
So have you. Grown more beautiful, I mean. Well, for a senator, I mean.
It's still got that wholesome center to it, but it's not the same because they are both older now. So again, there's a level of tension. Most evidently on Anakin's part, true, but it's there for Padme as well. Like I said, this situation renders them both a fish out of water. Anakin is being overly forward unintentionally, Padme is being overly hesitant, but is being unintentionally drawn out of her shell, both figuratively and literally. Also, when she walks off, Anakin is smiling. Well, why do you think he's smiling?
You smiling?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Why are you smiling?
All jokes aside, we know Anakin isn't some kind of sexual predator. So why is he smiling? From the time I first saw this movie, I always saw this as he was simply amused that he struck a nerve with her and made her a bit flustered. Just because she says she felt uncomfortable doesn't mean she didn't like him or that some part of her didn't like the advance. I'm going to play you an example from Scarface, of all things, to show you what I mean.
Keep it coming, baby.
Don't call me baby. I'm not your baby.
Not yet, man. You gotta give me some time.
Even if I were blind, desperate, you'd be the last thing I'd ever fuck.
That chick he's with. She like me.
How do you know?
I know. The eyes, Chico. They never lie.
George Lucas says in the Blu-ray commentary, which I will paraphrase, that the romance is underlying for the most part, but there are instances where it surfaces throughout the film.
She's beginning to see him as an attractive young man, but they've already decided in that very first awkward scene that they weren't going to go there with that first kiss. But obviously that kiss has opened up a whole set of underlying feelings that they can't get rid of that will be dealt with later on here. We're constantly playing with them, trying to connect in a romantic way, but her not giving into it, even though you can see that she's struggling just like he is. But I wanted a lot of the connections to be going on under the surface, and then only occasionally sort of reveal themselves, rather than being constant through the whole movie where they're constantly talking about their relationship.
To summarize, Padme felt uneasy about Anakin's advance because she was attracted to him, but she felt very conflicted about it. And especially being a senator in the political realm, having a public romance with a Jedi could easily be seen as a scandal. So both from an emotional standpoint and a professional standpoint, she wanted to distance herself from him. Despite wanting to keep herself distant, part of her wanted to indulge in the romance, which is why she kept dressing very extravagantly in front of him.
Stop that. Please don't look at me like that.
Stop what?
Why not?
Stop that. My hands are dirty. It makes me feel uncomfortable.
My hands are dirty too. What are you afraid of?
Not to get too preachy here, but let me give you a short rundown of basic psychology. There's these three elements that govern human behavior. The id, meaning the instinctual drives, the primitive part of the brain that wants to indulge in basic human needs and desires. Then there's the superego, which is essentially your higher brain function that understands morality and right and wrong. The part of the brain that prevents you from instantly acting on these needs without thought of consequence. And this acts as the counterbalance to the id. And finally, that brings us to the human ego, which perceives reality and weighs up the pros and cons influenced by both the id and the superego, which ultimately leads to a decision being made. This is why traditionally the older you get, the more your ego matures and is able to better regulate these psychological processes, allowing you to keep your id in check. This is why part of Padme wants to indulge in the romance as well as Anakin, but there's the part of her that's telling her, no, this is a bad idea, don't do it. The longer this goes on with the two of them in this situation with one another, the stronger these impulses become, and the harder it gets, which is why Anakin breaks first.
Anything is possible, Padme. Listen to me. You are asking me to be rational. That is something I know I cannot do. Well, it wouldn't have to be that way. We could keep it a secret.
And while she is still struggling, her ego maintains a sense of reality with a healthy influence from her superego.
We can't. It's just not possible. No, you listen. We live in a real world. Come back to it. You're studying to become a Jedi. I'm a senator. If you follow your thoughts through to conclusion, it'll take us to a place we cannot go. I will not let you give up your future for me.
And Padme keeps this frame of mind because, like it's very much implied, she is still the older and more mature and rational one of the two. The reason why she ultimately concedes to her impulses in the end is because she is going to die. And if she's going to die, there's no more arguments that the superego can bring to the table to influence the ego. Her ego perceives this reality, and so the id is now the primary influence on her decision making. And again, given what we know about the characters, both currently in the film and what we find out about Padme later on in the film, I submit that this is the most accurate interpretation of this scene, from both a character, story, and acting standpoint. Also, just one more note about Anakin not being a creeper in the film. Again, the reason why his dialogue comes across as overly forward and awkward is because of his upbringing and background, which I deem to be perfectly character consistent. However, you'll note that once Padme decides she can't indulge in the romance, even though part of her wants to, Anakin never brings it up again. During the entire second act of the film, Anakin never once makes any advances towards Padme. He only reciprocates when Padme decides to embrace it. And she only chooses to do this when they are both faced with a death sentence. Another thing I like about the romance is we see Anakin observe Padme in her element, and he gets a window into her upbringing in life while they spend their time on Naboo during the first half of the film, in which he makes several advances which are somewhat reciprocated until cooler heads prevail. Then when Anakin decides to go back to Tatooine, Padme is then observing Anakin in his element and gets another window into his life and his struggle. It's also worth noting that the last time Anakin was there with Padme was when they first found each other, and they're essentially picking up right where they left off, trying to find Shmi, exactly where they left her with Watto. It's another reason why Padme is so sympathetic to Anakin's situation, even after he snaps in a murderous rampage against the Tusken Raiders. She's the only one who truly understands what he's going through. She's the only one alive looking from the outside in who observed his life and relationship with his mother before he had to leave her behind. And now he finally makes it back to her, only for Shmi to die in his arms at the hands of what are essentially savages. So there you go. Some additional context for all of you to chew on. Anyway, let's move on.
And yet we're supposed to believe that she eventually falls in love with him? When? Ultimately, it neuters the climax of the third film because the audience was never given a reason to believe in this relationship to begin with.
Well, good luck having them buy that. I mean, you couldn't before, given the like to dislike ratio, and you sure as fuck ain't going to now.
I love you!
Liar!
Number 8. Bad writing.
Why couldn't I save her? I know I could have.
Okay, I'll bite. I love how you just bullet point bad writing and then clip a completely reasonable line of dialogue from Attack of the Clones. Do you just assume the audience hates everything that comes out of Hayden Christensen's mouth? You guys are terribly misinformed. No, actually, you're just terrible.
Many of the prequel's flaws come down to one simple fact. The writing is not strong. While the dialogue of A New Hope isn't without its clunkiness, the blandness and banality of the conversations found in the prequel films are challenges few actors could conquer.
Queen doesn't need to know.
Well, I don't approve.
Again, what the fuck are you talking about? Yes, there's certainly instances of poor writing sprinkled throughout the prequels. And all of the Star Wars films for that matter. Most notably Return of the Jedi, but that's a video for another time. Why did your douchebag of an editor show that scene between Qui-Gon and Padme? If you're trying to outline bad writing, then what was your point with that?
Many exchanges have awkward, forced dialogue, particularly the scenes between Anakin and Padme.
Oh my god, are you still on about that?
Or Anakin and Obi-Wan.
You were the chosen one!
So you have chosen death.
Unlike the original trilogy, the prequels are frequently guilty of over-explaining, telling much while showing very little.
I'm not afraid to die. I've been dying a little bit each day since you came back into my life.
What? Okay. First off, how does explaining too much but show very little translate to bad writing exactly, assuming you're correct? And secondly, you are fucking incorrect. What fucking idiot wrote this piece of shit video? I would argue the exact opposite when it comes to the prequels. The prequels have an enormous story to tell and simply don't have enough time to tell it as in-depth as George Lucas would have liked to. My references for this statement would be the hordes of deleted scenes for each of the Star Wars prequels. Scenes that were both finished in post and had to be cut out, animatics that weren't fully realized, or scenes that were only half completed. And that's not to say I think the movies are badly written as a result of this. Like I said, I think there's sprinkles of bad writing throughout, but the biggest weakness of the prequels, and Attack of the Clones in particular, is the lack of connective tissue. Though this is partially by design in order for the mystery element of the film to remain intact and for the twist at the end with Darth Tyrannus. I'll give you the perfect example of what I mean. Then I'll give you the perfect example of how the writing compensates for this in certain instances. In the picnic scene between Anakin and Padme, people have criticized this scene for not being very subtle when Anakin explains to Padme that he doesn't believe in the Republic, and he thinks something resembling a dictatorship would be a more effective means of government.
Well, then they should be made to.
By whom? Who's gonna make them?
I don't know. Someone.
You?
Of course not me.
But someone.
Someone wise.
Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me.
Well, if it works.
You're making fun of me.
No, I'd be much too frightened to tease a senator.
Here's a newsflash for those people. It was never meant to be subtle at all. It's meant to give the audience a window into Anakin's mindset. We know what he's destined to become. And even if we didn't, if we're watching this in chronological order, it's still a nice window into the character's mindset. Naturally, people then point the finger at Padme of why is she falling for a guy who's in favor of fascism, which I will add heavily conflicts with her ideology as a senator for the Republic, and would have most likely been another deal breaker for her concerning Anakin. Well, those people have nerve to talk about subtlety since they obviously didn't recognize that Anakin realized Padme didn't approve of his ideology, and so he decided to turn it into a joke.
Anakin realizes here that he's gone a little bit too far with her, and then turns it into a joke.
Padme doesn't take him seriously. She essentially thinks he's trolling her by the end, teasing that maybe she isn't doing her job right. And it's one of the major reasons I like the scene, and why the scene knows when it's being subtle and when it's not. People just assume George is being an idiot and doesn't know how to write, when that's absolutely not the case. But back to the lack of connective tissue, where does this ideology come from? I always saw it as a result of Anakin's background, his upbringing on Tatooine, growing up outside of the Republic as a slave, wanting to free slaves, he said so as a kid, and wanting to do good as a Jedi for other people, but being hindered by the bloated bureaucratic system, having been brought into the Republic from the outside looking in at an age where he was too old for the Jedi to indoctrinate him. Now, while I'm sure this is a huge part of Anakin's outlook on the clearly flawed political system of the Republic, George Lucas, on the commentary, intended this to be Palpatine's influence on Anakin surfacing within him.
So we have this little picnic where Anakin brings out the uncomfortable subject of previous boyfriends, which boys have a tendency to do. And then we get into this political discussion, which allows us to get a little insight into Anakin and Palpatine's influence over Anakin and some of his thought process.
Now, I can certainly buy this, especially with the further insight into their relationship in Revenge of the Sith, since we know early on that Anakin tells things to Palpatine that he doesn't even tell to Obi-Wan.
You wanted revenge. It wasn't the first time, Anakin. Remember what you told me about your mother and the Sand People?
As for Attack of the Clones, though, Anakin and Palpatine have only one single scene together.
They've finally given you an assignment. Your patience has paid off.
Your guidance more than my patience.
You don't need guidance, Anakin. In time, you will learn to trust your feelings. Then you will be invincible. I have said it many times. You are the most gifted Jedi I have ever met.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
We also get some insight into what Anakin thinks of Palpatine in the earlier talk with Obi-Wan, where he alludes to his faith in Palpatine as a politician and as a friend.
And don't forget, she's a politician and they're not to be trusted.
And besides, you're generalizing. The Chancellor doesn't appear to be corrupt.
Palpatine is a politician.
I think he's a good man.
I sense it too.
It says a lot about their relationship, but I don't see the translation of their relationship to this specific remark he makes to Padme about the state of government. I don't think it's a flawed scene at all. I think it makes perfectly sense with the characters and who they are. But herein lies my issue with Attack of the Clones. It's the lack of connective tissue in certain instances. And there are reasons for why Palpatine and Anakin didn't get additional scenes, or rather any pertaining to this particular topic, and that's again the mystery element George wanted to keep intact by keeping Palpatine firmly in the background. But if George was intending Anakin's remarks about the flawed state of government to be Palpatine's influence, then I would criticize that Anakin and Palpatine deserved a second scene together. Perhaps when Anakin was leaving Coruscant, he wanted to say goodbye to Palpatine and wish him luck with everything that was happening in the Senate. Maybe Palpatine could have wished him luck and told him not to fret about the pointlessness of the politics, a system which he himself believes to be flawed.
War is young men dying and old men talking. You know this. Ignore the politics.
Or something that points to the direction of Anakin being educated on the state of government by Palpatine himself to connect him to this scene. Otherwise, there simply isn't enough to infer that this philosophy of Anakin's came from Palpatine.
Well, then they should be made to.
By whom? Who's gonna make them?
I don't know. Someone.
You?
Of course not me.
But someone.
Someone wise.
Like I said, there's a lot of story to tell with the prequels, and certain instances lack connective tissue, or some extra tissue was filmed and had to be cut for deleted scenes, of which the prequels have a lot more than most films. The instances I'd point to reinforce this argument is the romance in Attack of the Clones and Padme's rebellion plot in Revenge of the Sith. This also means the prequels will lack certain nuances pertaining to the world and how it functions, unless it's directly applicable to the plot. For example, the intricacies of murder forensics, or the rules of slavery in the Outer Rim. And I attribute this weakness of Star Wars to the mitigating circumstance of Star Wars being entirely sci-fi and not based on any source material, as opposed to, for example, the MCU, which is partially sci-fi, by which I mean it takes place on Earth in our society and plays by a lot of well-known rules from our own reality and is based on comic books. Unlike the media of a novel, George isn't able to explain everything to us in great detail within the films themselves. Again, unless it's directly applicable to the plot and what's going on with the characters, otherwise it would derail the story for an exposition dump, as one would call it. This is not something George is particularly fond of, as you can see here.
This is a fun scene. It was very difficult to shoot because it's a very long scene, a lot of dialogue, and each take that we did was about 10 minutes long. The scene ultimately cut itself down to about, 6 or 8 minutes, I think this is. But it's a very complicated scene, and I tried to play it in its entirety. I didn't break it up into pieces. I actually played it all the way through, which was kind of tough on Jake, because he's only 9, 10 years old. And to remember all that dialogue at a 10-minute scene and without stopping is a challenge for anybody. But he did really well. Dining room scenes, eating scenes are always a little tricky to shoot because of the screen direction. And the fact that I've got them basically sitting around the table talking for 10 minutes. You're sort of worried that it's not going to play, especially in something that is, in essence, an action picture. This is nothing but a very long exposition scene. You come up with things like the jokes with Jar Jar and developing his earnest character, which allow you to play the scene out as long as it plays out in order to get all the exposition out that has to be told. Almost every other word out of someone's mouth in this scene is a key expository story that needs to be told in order to understand what's going to happen next. There's a lot of mechanical things going on here. How do they get the pods? How do they get in the race? How are they going to get their engine parts? There's all that stuff comes together and is told in this one scene. You always have a scene like this in a movie. We call it the pointer scene. Classic one is in Indiana Jones, where government agents come and he explains what the Ark of the Covenant is. Well, unfortunately, it's a scene you always have to have in a movie. You have to stick it somewhere. Nobody wants to do it. It's hard to get through because you're afraid it's going to be boring, but it's absolutely essential in terms of telling the story.
Not to mention the fact that George was discouraged from using exposition since he collectively used less than 5 minutes of Senate meetings in the first 2 prequel films, and given the wild reaction this had from some fanatical audience members, it's not hard to see why some details weren't fully flushed out as good as I'm sure George would have liked to.
Oh, I move for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. Who gives a shit? Seriously, who cares? This movie was made for kids. You really think they're going to sit down and watch that? A Senate meeting?
And as I've said previously, Star Wars is a universe built from the ground up by one man, like any author in his novel. This is not a person or company adapting the source material from an extremely detailed novel or comic where the rules of the universe have been made clear. It's up to the author, in this case George Lucas, to make the universe feel like it could function in existence. And not in novel format, but as a film, and in this case a saga of films. This reminds me of the quote from Inception where Leonardo DiCaprio's character tells Ellen Page that she needs to design a dream world for someone who is asleep.
How could I ever acquire enough detail to make them think that it's reality?
I'll give you the perfect example of what I'm talking about. Jango Fett uses a silent poison dart instead of a blaster shot to kill Zam. Now, I have my own arguments in favor of why Jango does this, but that's beside the point in this instance. The dart itself, while highly untraceable, can still be traced, while one would think a blaster shot is completely untraceable. So why didn't he just use the blaster? And this got me thinking, if blasters are untraceable, why would an assassin require any other weapon 90% of the time? Like, don't get me wrong, I'm sure an assassin would require that kind of stealth weaponry for all sorts of cases. A poison dart, some kind of hidden blade, or even explosives or toxic gas. Since the whole point of an assassin is to take out the target without getting caught and without any obstruction. I'd imagine the darts would be good for infiltration since it's quiet weaponry and wouldn't easily alert guards, and it would be less likely to alert even Jedi for that matter. But even so, if Jango Fett has a bucket over his head and cannot be identified, and if blasters had no way of being traced at all, then I'd imagine that would make his job a lot easier than one would think. Not to mention, in a city like Coruscant with billions of people, and where blasters are very common and people likely die to blasters every day over many different squabbles, and not to mention Coruscant is just one planet in Republic space, because of this, and now I'm just speaking from common sense, I have no actual reference for this, but here I'd assume in this vast universe that there would be some way to trace the blaster fire from a registered weapon for simple law and order to function in the Republic. Otherwise, people would be getting away with murder on an outrageous scale. But the details weren't provided because it wasn't directly applicable to the plot. It's the kind of unwritten rule I would equate to the inability to lightspeed ram another object in space. At least until that rule was broken. It's nowhere written or spoken about, but common sense in both cases dictates an inference that the rule exists. That the universe accounts for this in some way in order for the universe itself to function, as constructed. And let's be clear here, there's a very sharp distinction between inferring an unwritten rule from the universe that affects the plot, and coming up with a theory out of thin air unsupported by references that also contradicts past movies to fill in a plot hole. In addition to that, when Star Wars came out in 1977, it was a story surrounding outlaws in space and an empire that imposed martial law on the galaxy, more or less. The blasters were simply a sci-fi element as opposed to guns and bullets, where forensic intricacies and means to trace these weapons have been well documented in our own reality. Star Wars, in its original inception, wasn't designed with the intent of having a forensic investigation plotline. Let me provide an additional example. Midichlorians. Now, I'm going to go further into this a bit later in the video, so I'll be brief here. But when the original trilogy was being made, do you think that the Midichlorians were ever originally a part of George Lucas's outline for Star Wars? I personally am willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he had the concept of Midichlorians on the drawing board somewhere.
Well, what do you know?
But even if George had no idea what the Midichlorians were back in 1983, why didn't the concept of midichlorians matter to the original trilogy? And why wasn't this concept, along with the intricacies of Jedi selection, introduced until The Phantom Menace? The answer is that it wasn't directly plot relevant or necessary until then. The original trilogy functions perfectly fine without the midichlorians being a plot point. The reason being, Luke Skywalker wasn't a Jedi selected. He and Leia were essentially the last hope for the universe and the Jedi Order.
You are reckless. He is too old. Yes, too old to begin the training. When gone am I, the last of the Jedi will you be? That is all you have learned.
And all of the Jedi were dead, so there was no need to ground the Force with such a concept to prevent an oversaturation of Jedi in the lore. In The Phantom Menace, it was introduced because it was directly applicable to the finding and selection of Anakin Skywalker, not to mention an explanation for his advanced skills and learning capabilities, as well as being part of the standard procedure for how potential Jedis are identified and selected, and why Jedi selection is limited in the universe. But to dial it back to the intricacies of blaster fire in the Star Wars universe, as I said before, this is one particular instance where sci-fi stories that take place in our own universe have something of a shortcut. A handicap, if you will, because the sci-fi elements are only partial, and we already know how guns and bullets can be traced, with serial numbers, fingerprints, etc. As opposed to Star Wars, where some of these details are unfortunately going to be lost, due to time constraints, and due to keeping the focus firmly on the plot. The key is to find the balance of a healthy flow between world building and plot development. The details of forensic intricacies for blasters is missing because it wasn't directly applicable to the plot. Zam was shot with a dart, not a blaster, and so George shows us how forensics work with projectiles, not blasters. And even that was moved to the deleted scenes. Queen Amidala's circumstances for becoming queen in the first place at a very young age are missing because it wasn't directly applicable to the plot.
They tried to help the newly elected child Queen Amidala, which you don't elect queens and queens can't be children, but whatevs.
Instead, she is simply given the status of queen from the get-go. The details pertaining to Padme's family and life as a child was moved to the deleted scenes of Attack of the Clones, and mentioned very sparingly in the final cut, in scenes of which it wasn't the primary focus, and so on and so forth. I'd like to briefly equate this to The Lord of the Rings, because aside from the MCU, it's the only cinematic saga that rivals Star Wars in terms of its depth and scale. It's based on 3 legendary novels by J.R.R. Tolkien, and like the prequels, had ridiculous amounts of deleted scenes that contained important information pertaining to the Lord of the Rings world. So much so, in fact, that they released the extended editions, which collectively add close to an hour to each theatrical cut, that many fans, myself included, consider to be the true version of the films. This is a treatment which I personally believe is also very much warranted for the prequels. I yearn for the day that released the prequel extended cut trends worldwide, because there's so much good that had to be cut from the theatrical versions. because it wasn't essential to the plot despite its quality. Just like the example I will use, which is the theatrical cut of The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, which was one of my first ever DVDs. I watched that thing a ludicrous amount of times on repeat. I didn't see the extended cut till I was already a man. And without the extended edition, I never would have realized Aragorn's true age and the unique properties of extended life that applied to his bloodline. Because in the theatrical cut that wasn't relevant, only that Aragorn was indeed the heir to the throne. Similarly with The Two Towers is Faramir's relationship to Boromir, which we never got to see. In the theatrical cut, you can tell deep down Faramir loves his brother, but the way it's cut together, to me, told a different story. I inferred that the relationship was strained somewhat. Perhaps Faramir and Boromir had a falling out, and Faramir carried a lot of bitter resentment towards his brother. But in the extended version, it's revealed that that's not the case at all. Faramir did carry bitterness, but it was mainly directed towards his father, who never appreciated him. In actuality, he and Boromir were incredibly close, and Faramir always looked up to him. However, it would be extremely hard to infer this from the theatrical version, because while this nuance existed, it had to be cut out for time purposes due to its overall irrelevance to what the main story was. Both examples I used contained excellent pieces of world building and character insight, and like Lord of the Rings, there's many details pertaining to Star Wars that weren't explained in the final cut of the films. Details George wanted to flush out and explain, but simultaneously he has a limited time to tell his story, and he has to build the world around it while he tells it. And most importantly, he has to make it feel like a functioning universe connected by rules that make sense. So how does George compensate for this? Back to the point of WatchMojo about the prequels having bad dialogue, I would argue that this isn't quite the case. There are certainly instances where the dialogue can be somewhat poorly worded.
Be mindful of your thoughts, Anakin, they betray. You've made a commitment to the Jedi Order, a commitment not easily broken.
And there are instances where it can be very jarring due to how heavily it was inspired by another source.
My heart is beating, hoping that kiss will not become a scar.
And sometimes the dialogue can miss the mark on delivery. But I don't think it's fair, in fact I think it's extremely uncharitable to take a quote out of context and slap the label of bad dialogue on the movies, when it is certainly much more of a mixed bag. I would happily submit that the prequels have a ton of great writing in them, and my reason would be how George tells us so much about the world he's crafted by telling us so little that deviates from the main story that's going on. I'll point out only two examples for the sake of time. When Anakin first meets Padme and the scene goes as follows.
Annie? My goodness, you've grown.
So have you. Grown more beautiful, I mean. Well, for a senator, I mean.
We see several things about his character. We learn that Anakin is attracted to Padme. Secondly, how Anakin isn't used to interacting with women, or rather women he is attracted to, coming across as very bold and inappropriate. And we can infer this due to his upbringing as a Jedi away from any and all attachments. If you look at this scene, you can see even Obi-Wan is caught off guard, feeling awkward in his presence. Padme also looks to be shaken by the remark, but based on what we learn about her past, I'd also infer that part of her really appreciates the compliment, especially coming from someone like Anakin, of all people, who's out of the political realm and has no agenda, and who she remembers has a tendency to speak his mind around her. People criticize this scene for being cringy and awkward when that's entirely the point. To provide the audience some details to which they can infer certain things about Anakin's character development since The Phantom Menace, which they get more later on in the films through various other details which are given in a similar way, without George explicitly stopping the story to tell them. The second example I want to present is Obi-Wan's first encounter with the Kaminoans.
Master Jedi, the Prime Minister is expecting you.
I'm expected?
Of course, he is anxious to meet you. After all these years, we were beginning to think you weren't coming. Now please, this way.
In the timeline, we already have the context from Dex that they are cloners. They keep to themselves mostly, and that they're friendly if you're a big spender.
Kaminoans keep to themselves. They're cloners.
Cloners? Are they friendly?
Oh, it depends on how good your manners are, how big your pocketbook is.
Now, just by this one interaction, what does this tell us about the Kaminoans? We don't know about the clone army as of yet, but since we know their occupation is cloning, thanks to Dex, and the Kaminoans being an alien species because of their occupation, we can infer that they have incredibly long lifespans. We can also infer that they are extremely patient creatures. First, again, because of their long lifespans, and secondly, because according to the female Kaminoan, they've been expecting the arrival of a Jedi Master for years and years, and her reaction can loosely be described as what I would call mild annoyance, the kind you might get from a friend if you're invited to their house for dinner and you show up an hour late without calling. The scene with the Prime Minister of Kamino, and later on Jango Fett, give greater insight into the plot and the timeline whilst keeping the mystery element intact. But just from this one exchange between Obi-Wan and the Kaminoan, with both the dialogue and the mannerisms of how the dialogue is delivered and how the characters react to each other, it allows the audience to credibly infer so much about the plot and the characters and the universe. And this is where I give the writing of the prequels huge props. It tells the story while world building, and except for a few instances, stops the plot in its tracks to explain things. The prequels do this by telling us very little but alluding to so much. In other words, George tells us the immediate plot but also provides many inferences for the events and the stories surrounding the plot that allows the attentive audience member to pick up on and connect the dots to gain a clearer understanding. But to put it plainly, it encourages the audience to think without forcing them to invent their own fan fictions out of thin air. However, I'd like to provide an example of relying too heavily on inference. The prequels don't do this often, but the one instance where I don't excuse it is Dexter Jettster. Now, I like Dexter Jettster. I think he's a cool character. Most people I've heard comment on this scene have issues pertaining to the CGI portrayal of the character and the 50s diner look of the scene, which is just retarded. The actual problem with this scene is that we don't know enough about Dex. Without Dex, Obi-Wan's trail runs cold. The purpose of this scene, according to Lucas on the Blu-ray commentary, and I'll paraphrase here, was to show that the Jedi don't know everything, and that they approach matters like this with a very narrow mind due to their arrogance. In George's own words, the Jedi couldn't identify the origins of this dart, yet this random diner owner could.
The functional part of this scene is for Obi-Wan to find out where this particular toxic dart came from. Originally, we had another scene before this which had some analysis droids who couldn't figure it out, came here to find out the answer. But ultimately, I realized that the two scenes were redundant and repeated themselves, and so I felt this was the better of the two scenes, because later on we go back to the Jedi Temple, to the library, and get the sense of sort of arrogance on the part of the Jedi in terms of if they think they know everything, but in this case, cafe owner knows more than what's in the Jedi library.
He also wanted to include Dex to allude to Obi-Wan's long career as a Jedi and the contacts and friends he's made along the way. This is an example of what I'd describe as good inference, and something I certainly gained from the scene since the first time I watched it. The bad is, once again, who is Dex? How does Dex know this information? He's come seemingly out of nowhere and has important plot information that allows it to progress. Now, Yoda was a character that came out of nowhere in The Empire Strikes Back. Yoda was a mysterious character with very little backstory, which was intentional by Lucas for Yoda to have zero backstory. And despite this, Yoda heavily influenced the plot. But we were told that he was a Jedi Master who instructed Obi-Wan. Any inferences we wanted to make about Yoda's character aren't directly plot relevant, and any that are relevant to the plot have a level of credibility behind it due to the information provided. If fans want to infer things about Yoda's backstory that wasn't plot relevant, they would essentially be writing their own fan fiction of who Yoda is, because they have a blank slate to work with in terms of information outside Yoda's Jedi title. And this is fine, by the way. There's no issue with fans coming up with their own headcanon of how Yoda ended up on Dagobah before Revenge of the Sith was released, because those details had nothing to do with The Empire Strikes Back, though admittedly some people can take their fanfictions way too far.
About that. He takes his lightsaber, he starts jumping around and flipping and everything, and it's nuts. And people loved it for some reason. Some people really like that scene. I don't know why. It's one of the dumbest moments in the entire saga.
This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight. Not as clumsy or random as a blaster. An elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
What does Yoda say in The Empire Strikes Back? He says the Force is not about muscle, this crude matter here. No, it's not about that. Remember that? It's not about your lightsaber. It's not about flailing around. It's not about doing fucking barrel rolls in the air.
It is obvious that this contest cannot be decided by our knowledge of the Force, but by our skills with a lightsaber.
This problem is at the core of what I hate about the prequels. And that problem
is Yoda. It absolutely blows my mind that people don't have a bigger problem with Yoda in this trilogy. Because if you ask me, this is blatant character assassination. Seeing Yoda with a lightsaber fills me with so much dread, and honestly, I can't explain it.
His lightsaber. Ah, yes. A Jedi's weapon.
Now with Dex, what do we know? We know he has spent a great deal of time in the Outer Rim. He's something of a weapons expert, which could be related to his occupational history, and he knows about how the forensic droid analysts operate.
I ain't seen one of these since I was prospecting on Subterrell, beyond the Outer Rim. What you got here is a Camino saber dart.
I wonder why it didn't show up in the analysis archive.
You see, funny little cuts on the side that give it away. Those analysis droids only focus on symbols.
Now this is all good stuff, but it's not enough. It's not that Dex can't know this information, but again, just who is he? Based on the information provided in the film, I can infer three things. 1. Dex is a former Jedi. 2. Dex is a former bounty hunter who's used this type of weaponry before. 3. Dex is some kind of former Republic intelligence operative who has extensive knowledge on forensics with foreign weaponry. This is simply too much of a loose end to be deemed as credible inference, because it's inconclusive. I get that the mystery element is kind of the point, but this could have all been fixed by Dex passively mentioning his job title. Unlike Queen Amidala's history or the details of tracing blaster fire, Dex's occupational history is directly applicable to the plot, and since it is relevant and could so easily be mentioned in conversation because it's applicable, it cannot be excused. An inference in this case cannot be a substitute for a lack of connective tissue. In other words, I'd be coming up with a fan fiction of who Dex is in order for the character to make more sense and justify this. There's enough references to infer his knowledge, but not his identity or occupation for where the knowledge comes from. I hope you all understand the difference with what I mean by credible inference and non-credible inference. And this is why inference is important in script writing in all films, and Star Wars in particular. Films are on a time crunch. There is very limited time to explain the world and its rules because at the same time you have to tell your story. Unlike novels, which have a much more generous time frame to be detailed and concise in order to get the reader familiar with the world and its rules, not to mention you can literally dive into the characters' minds and understand their thought process, where in film you have to illustrate it visually. And it's less comprehensive and nuanced as it would be in a novel. Though there are several filmmaking tools directors and writers use to circumvent this limitation, such as using an audio dub to tell the audience what the character is thinking. Revenge of the Sith does this at several points throughout the film.
Yes, but he was an unarmed prisoner. I shouldn't have done that. It's not the Jedi way.
It is only natural. He cut off your arm, and you wanted revenge. It wasn't the first time, Anakin. Remember what you told me about your mother and the Sand people?
Do know that if the Jedi destroy me, any chance of saving her will be lost.
No. Oh, no.
Or you could have the main protagonist narrate an introduction to the world, its rules, and its factions, like in the film Divergent, a 2014 book-to-movie adaptation that takes place in a fictional post-apocalyptic Chicago, Illinois.
We're lucky to be in the city. They say the war was terrible, that the rest of the world was destroyed. Our founders built the wall to keep us safe, and they divided us into 5 groups, factions, to keep the peace.
Though this is a stylistic choice that wasn't featured in any of the Star Wars movies to remain consistent with the formula, but George Lucas compensated for this in another way. The Star Wars films have no narrator, but that's the very purpose of the opening crawl for each of the Star Wars films, to act as a brief introductory narration in text form to tell the audience what they need to know for the universe in a short span of time, to quickly kick the movie into gear, since the film is on a time crunch. But generally speaking, for an entirely fictional sci-fi universe written for screenplay that hasn't been adapted from a novel, which still needs to be explained in 2 hours and 20 minutes, there are going to be details pertaining to the universe, its cultures, its government, its machines, its religions, its magic, and its factions that are going to be glossed over or scarcely mentioned for the sake of time.
I gather from what I've been told that my very dear friend, whom I loved very much, was a wonderful human being as well as being a magnificent actor, the late and much lamented Peter Cushing. I gather he reappears in this. Don't ask me how, I don't know. Of course, he was in the first Star Wars film. I always remember, after I'd seen him, I rang him up and I said, what on earth is a Grand Moff Tarkin? Faintest idea. I didn't think he ever asked George why he was called that. But then George's imagination is unlike anything I think I've ever come across. It's unbelievable. My own history, just one person, one character in the Star Wars saga. I mean, I've got 4 or 5 pages about Dooku, where he was born, things that he invented. He was born on a planet called Sereno. And all these different characters have different elements. Everyone has a reason for being who they are. It's quite amazing. It really is.
Obviously, this has to be judged case by case with science fiction and fantasy movies. Not to mention scale and ambition certainly plays a big part in the writing process. But for example, let's take the case of The Force Awakens. Still a Star Wars movie, but the circumstances are very different to the prequels because The Force Awakens is a Star Wars fan fiction created by Disney that is adapting a source material from George Lucas. And not only that, but it's also acting as a sequel to his story. There's already a universe with rules and characters in play, and thus they have to put in far less legwork to develop it. But if The Force Awakens wants to be a sequel, they still need to establish the current state of the galaxy, the timeline, what happened to the characters and the factions, and most importantly, why these things are the way they are. And The Force Awakens didn't even try. Instead, it glossed over just about everything so that the pieces could be on the board where Disney wanted them to be, and only scarcely mentioned these details in retrospect, which still didn't make any sense with who these pre-established characters were, which is why many details are lost and the state of the galaxy is poorly developed to the degree of it being practically unknown. That is, until it's nuked out of existence, so that no more questions would be asked. The point I'm trying to outline here is that even though films are on a time crunch to explain an entirely fictional universe, some films will very blatantly show the middle finger to this concept of writing, and certainly deserve to be chastised for lacking in this regard. Painting with a very broad stroke here, good writing is progressing the plot and building the world around it, and taking full advantage of the time that's given to you. However, focusing only on the plot and actively leaving the world or universe completely ambiguous with its details can be a form of bad writing, and it often rears its ugly head most often when it's a story that takes place in a fictional universe, with the sci-fi and fantasy genres. But this is in regards to film, and it's the reason episodic television series should be given far less leniency in this aspect, especially if it's based on a highly detailed source material where the roadmap and details are clearly laid out. Unlike a 2-hour and 20-minute movie, television series are episodic. They have the potential to be far more nuanced. Take The Mandalorian Episode 1, for example, the pilot episode. I was heavily criticized for finding the opening episode to be average at best, while the majority of the internet was praising it to the stars. Now, ideally, a pilot episode is meant to introduce the world, its characters, the factions, and what is going on. It's also meant to be extremely well paced, so they can maximize its potential to hook the audience by providing as much nuance as possible. People told me that episode 1 of The Mandalorian had excellent world building, and even though it had better world building than the Disney trilogy, it still wasn't very good. The reason being, the writers assumed the audience was well acquainted with Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, for which I was not. Watching the episode, I was confused as to what the Mandalorians were exactly. I assumed they were a bounty hunters guild, when in actuality they were a culture. I had no idea that this was a bounty hunters guild establishment and not just a regular cantina. I had no idea what the currencies were that were being used and why they were significant. And I had no idea why Beskar armor was so valuable and important to Mandalorians, just to name but a few things. And all of these issues I had get resolved by episode 3 of the series, but I heavily criticized this because of how much screen time was wasted in the pilot episode. The examples I point to was the opening of the episode, which heavily dragged out for a character and a payoff that was ultimately inconsequential to the rest of the season. Not to mention a lesson on riding dinosaurs, which could have been completely cut out or trimmed down. And this would have allowed for more time in the episode to flush out the characters and the details of the world. Now again, The Mandalorian as an episodic series has a much more lenient time frame to explain itself, but I was still baffled by how poorly the time was utilized in episode 1. What was unclear in the pilot episode was explained in episode 3, but why? Why this decision was made, I have no idea. This is one of those instances where I'm proud to say that if I was not a Star Wars fan, I would have quit watching after episode 1. But my point's this. The Mandalorian can take its time explaining itself since it's episodic. The prequels as films are on much more of a time crunch. The prequels had to essentially build a fully functional and civilized galaxy in play and explain its downfall in 3 films. The Mandalorian is an episodic Disney fanfiction which takes place in an already fleshed out universe in a timeline post Return of the Jedi. I use The Mandalorian Season 1 as a prime example of why the prequels utilize their time especially well to tell their story. I also use it for why episodic television has a much more lenient time frame and can still not do a very good job in this regard. Now, the reason why inference especially applies to Star Wars, as few people mention, is because Star Wars is something of an anomaly, pun intended. A vast universe made up entirely of sci-fi designed by one author who was able to make his story into a saga of movies that reached an incredible scale by the end. Meaning the world, its characters, its plot, and its world building were created without adapting the universe from someone else's source material who had already put in the legwork.
Anyone can write a book. Fewer people can write a good book. Fewer people can turn their book into a movie. Even fewer people than that can turn a book in a sci-fi universe in a galaxy far, far away into a movie. Because it's just too fucking expensive.
Of course, it also depends on the scale of the science fiction story being told. This is why A New Hope, and particularly Empire Strikes Back, feel so grounded in reality without much need for inference because the scale is much smaller. It's not as complex.
I was very clever in the first Star Wars films in that I kept the design very simple. And I avoided situations where I was going to get into trouble design-wise. This one, I'm daring to take the chance and see what happens.
Like I said, blasters were used, but never did we even remotely need to consider if they could be traced through murder investigation. Because we didn't know the state of the galaxy and its law and order beyond the martial law of the Empire. The focus was kept on the characters and lesser on the world. This, however, did leave a lot to be desired on a larger scale. But the larger the scale, the more questions need to be answered, especially if the media is sci-fi and fantasy. And without inference, just about every sci-fi or fantasy movie would be lacking, which is why inference is so important for writing in film. If you know how to utilize inference effectively, you can tell a much larger story in a more grandiose world that's still objectively solid in how it functions. And it's my firm stance that this is where George excelled with the prequels in terms of writing. It wasn't flawless, but it fulfilled his ambition to mostly great effect. I'm sorry for the extremely long tangent. Anyway, I hope you understand what I mean by inference and why it's important. I'm not saying there aren't any exceptions to the matter and the information I've brought forward, but there is a reason why this heavily applies to Star Wars, because unlike 99% of other medias that are sci-fi on a grand scale, Star Wars didn't come from an author or a comic or a source material other than George Lucas himself. It had the scale of a novel that was written for its own screenplay. However, regarding my comments on the importance of utilizing inference and the unique circumstances that pertain to the production of Star Wars and its universe as opposed to most other media and film, I'm not saying this gives the movies a free pass by any stretch of the imagination, nor am I using this as special treatment solely because the topic at hand is, in fact, Star Wars. The mitigating circumstances I've mentioned regarding Star Wars' production can be applied to any other film that meets the same criteria, and every production needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. But no matter what, there's no mitigating circumstance to justify basic fundamental don'ts of screenwriting, including but not limited to things like plot armor, deus ex machina, progressing the plot at the sacrifice of character intelligence, or just a lack of basic common sense. And make no mistake, all of these criticisms can be applied to each and every single one of the Star Wars movies. Anyway, let's get back to WatchMojo.
Number 7. They forced in characters from the original trilogy.
Fett demanded only one thing. An unaltered clone for himself.
Okay, here comes another long tangent. Who fucking gives a shit?
Obviously, when telling the story of how a young boy named Anakin Skywalker turned into Darth Vader, there are going to be some characters from the original trilogy. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda are guaranteed, but did we really need to see that Anakin built C-3PO or that R2-D2 was involved in nearly every important moment?
R2? What are you doing here?
Well, in case you hadn't caught on, R2-D2 was a droid that belonged to the Royal Naboo cruiser. The droid stuck with Padme, who was the Queen of Naboo, who transitioned to Senator during the 10-year gap between The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. We can infer that she took a liking to the droid and that she decided to keep it as her personal possession. Hell, R2-D2 was the droid she used when she flew the Naboo starfighter to Coruscant in the beginning of Attack of the Clones. And throughout Attack of the Clones, R2-D2 acts as security while Padme sleeps. R2-D2 follows her throughout her journey to Naboo. It follows her on her journey to Tatooine. It also saves her life in the Geonosian droid factory. R2 is also a witness at her wedding, for goodness sake, with Anakin. And after that, you can gather as a family, R2 also became Anakin's droid, which is why you see it accompany him in Revenge of the Sith during the opening battle of Coruscant and for most of the movie. Now that's what you can actually gather from the movies themselves. And just a side note, according to the novelization of the movie, from people who have reached out to me, they've told me that R2 and 3PO were actually wedding gifts from Anakin and Padme to one another. Now this detail had no bearing on the plot whatsoever, and George wanted to shoot the climax of episode 2 in complete silence, except for the visual and the music. The climax of episode 2 being the clones moving off into battle, and the forbidden wedding taking place on Naboo, which is why this detail wasn't mentioned in the final scene with the wedding of Anakin and Padme. Now, we have nothing to infer R2-D2 and 3PO being wedding gifts specifically from the movie, as I just outlined, but this is the detail one would find in the novelization, if it's not mentioned in the movie. Something that's inconsequential to the films, but provide further context for the films themselves and their characters. Anyway, back on point, who cares which characters they inserted from the oh-so-precious original trilogy, especially if they are given justification and purpose like R2-D2 was?
Even worse, elements like Boba Fett being a clone or visiting Chewbacca's home planet seemed completely unnecessary, and only made the plot more convoluted.
Boba Fett's a clone. How is that convoluted? You just explained it. And yeah, Kashyyyk is a system of the Republic under attack by the droid armies of the Separatist movement. I find it laughable that some people try to frame it as pointless fan service.
Is there any significance to the Kashyyyk scenes? No, they just wanted to show us Chewbacca and—
But grasp at whatever straws you can, I guess.
By shoehorning these characters in, the films actually created several plot holes in the original trilogy that previously didn't exist.
Okay, which plot holes exactly are you referring to? You're not really saying anything, you're just making a statement with no references or evidence to back you up. Seriously, what monkey did you have on staff that edited this piece of shit?
Number 6. Too much politics.
As you know, our blockade is perfectly legal, and we'd be happy to receive the ambassadors.
I can't believe that's actually a problem people have with the movies. As I mentioned previously, there's collectively less than 5 minutes across the first 2 movies when it comes to the Senate meetings, and people threw a bitch fit over it because they actually had to use their brains for once. Too much politics is also such a sweeping statement about the fans that paints them in a terrible light. Those idiots certainly exist, but they share no bracket with me or any other fans of the movies who actually watched them. Lumping us in with that crowd paints the fans as a whole as extremely shallow. Like we just want space battles and lightsaber fights or something. Like, how telling is that of what little respect WatchMojo and the mainstream have for Star Wars fans? It's no doubt why the Disney movies made no fucking sense, because they didn't take the time to explain the state of the galaxy and world build like George did. And this is because they listened and pandered to the vocal minority crowd of idiots.
Yes, the original films are set against a political backdrop, but the idea is fairly simple. A group of rebels attempts to take down a tyrannical empire. A New Hope is even simpler, as our heroes spend most of the film attempting to rescue a kidnapped princess.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
Yeah, the original trilogy was very simple. The prequels opened the audience up to something much more complex, but still kept it simple enough for 12-year-olds to understand, which is why it blows my mind it's mostly the adults from the Boba Fett era that seem to have a problem with the politics. Not the intricacies of the politics, but just the politics themselves.
The first film of the prequels, however, revolves around a complicated interplanetary trade dispute. While the opening scene of the film has 2 Jedi Knights attempting to negotiate with the Trade Federation to end a blockade.
What the fuck was so complicated about that? The opening of Empire Strikes Back is about droids landing in the snow and walkie-talkies. But I was still paying attention to what the fuck was going on. Political squabbling doesn't by default equal bad, nor does it equal boring.
I sense an unusual amount of fear for something as trivial as this trade dispute.
Politics can be interesting, and can be effectively worked into an action-adventure film, but trade routes and blockades aren't quite what the audience was expecting.
You were right about one thing, Master. The negotiations were short.
Finally, we can agree on something. Yeah, trade blockades and politics weren't what the audience was expecting, but that's not the fault of George Lucas or his movies. That falls on the audience. I don't go to the movies to see my expectations play out on screen unless the artist has directly supported those expectations by how he set up the story. But they still have every right to tell their story the way they want. And that's why we pay our tickets, to watch their story, not ours.
Number 5. Midichlorians.
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power.
Oh boy, I knew this was coming up eventually. I can't wait.
It's an energy field created by all living things.
In the original trilogy, Obi-Wan described the Force to Luke as an energy field created by all living beings. It was mysterious, it was powerful, and it was ruined in the prequels thanks to midichlorians.
Not that you or your company actually gave a shit, you're just pretending to curry favor with the lowest common denominator of audience members.
I need a midichlorian count.
In the first film, Qui-Gon Jinn detects that Anakin is powerful with the Force by analyzing the midichlorian count in his blood, a move that completely undermines the faith-like way the Force was previously presented.
Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force.
Well, obviously you never took a fucking biology class. Allow me to explain how the midichlorians work.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Obi-Wan refers to the Force as an energy field that surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the universe together. Yoda expands upon this in The Empire Strikes Back. What does Qui-Gon say exactly? Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells. Not human cells, all living cells. Which is why Twi'leks and Muns can still use the Force as well. In other words, the midichlorians are ubiquitous to life, and it's a symbiotic organism with living beings that allows them to tap into the energy field that is the Force. Luke has said that the Force is strong in my family, so we have precedent for the Force affinity of an individual to be passed on through genetics. And the midichlorians fall very much in line with that. Now, how the process works is still very much ambiguous to keep the mystery element of the Force intact. Anakin was conceived by the midichlorians, was Qui-Gon's theory.
The Force is unusually strong with him. That much is clear. Who was his father?
There was no father. I carried him, I gave birth, I raised him. I can't explain what happened.
A boy. His cells have the highest concentration of midichlorians I have seen in a life form. It is possible he was conceived by the midichlorians.
But it's never explained how. But what the midichlorians does explain is how Luke was a prodigy with the Force who learned quickly and whose powers rivaled that of his father, despite being an unconventional Jedi. The midichlorians don't ruin the concept of the Force, instead it allows people in the Star Wars universe to measure how Force-sensitive an individual is, which is why Anakin was so powerful. He was essentially a freak of nature, with how strong he was. Without a concept to ground the Force, anyone could essentially become a Jedi. With rules like the midichlorians, that however allows only a select amount of people to tap into the Force and have the potential to become a Jedi. Instead of it being like, say, The Matrix, for example, where anyone who is jacked into the computer system can believe that they can dodge bullets and punch through walls, etc. And how good they are in combat depends on how much they believe in themselves, essentially.
You're too fast. Do you believe that my being stronger or faster has anything to do with my muscles in this place? What are you waiting for? You're faster than this. Don't think you are. Know you are. Come on, stop trying to hit me and hit me. Free your mind.
This works fine for the universe of The Matrix, but Star Wars is obviously very different. I find that most people who hate the midichlorians hate them for one of two reasons. The first being that they simply don't like the artist's choice to ground the Force into a more realistic concept, because now not just anyone in their Boba Fett fucking pajamas can just believe they can lift an X-Wing anymore.
And just when you thought that the Star Wars saga couldn't get any more confusing, George Lucas decided to introduce midichlorians into the mix. That's right. Apparently everyone just has little microscopic organisms floating around the inside of their bodies, and whoever listens to them correctly can understand the Force. It's not a mystical thing that binds us together with everyone in the galaxy, it's just these little organisms that live inside our body.
Or the second reason being that they simply do not understand how the midichlorians work when it's really very simple.
So then George Lucas completely and utterly finally ruined Star Wars forever, having Qui-Gon explain that the Force is microscopic organisms.
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
Or that microscopic organisms in our cells tell us about the Force, or something. This entire idea is so baffling to me that I cannot even wrap my mind around it.
You know, it's a film for 12-year-olds.
To conclude, midichlorians are not the Force. They are a means of measuring Force sensitivity and communicating with the Force, allowing an individual to tap into it. The Force is still mystical, but grounded with biology. That's why you can still lift rocks and mechanicals with the Force, despite the fact these objects aren't organic. They have no living cells. There's no midichlorians in them. Yet they are being levitated by the Force, which is being controlled by the individual who is using the Force. And the catalyst for this relationship between the Force and the Force user is the midichlorians.
Damn, I'm good! Can you feel that? Huh? Can you feel it, Captain Compost?
Does that make enough sense for everybody? Wonderful. But it's important to note that midichlorians isn't the deciding factor for a Jedi's skill. That's why Obi-Wan was still able to hold his own against Anakin during the duel on Mustafar. Anakin was younger and more powerful, and Obi-Wan was older and more experienced. And as a result, he had more training throughout his life. How we finally squashed this stupid argument. Good.
One of the biggest complaints with the prequels is that they provided explanations for things that didn't need an explanation. And this is the perfect example. The Force was awesome on its own. It didn't need a backstory. Sometimes, less is more.
Okay, well now you're saying it doesn't need a backstory, when that's entirely up to the artist. Now you're just disagreeing on preference alone. You're not saying why it's bad. And yeah, less is more, but if it was the height of the Republic with thousands of Jedi, one could make the criticism of if everyone can just believe in the Force, why aren't there more Jedi? Why can't everyone lift an X-Wing? Without a concept to ground the Force in some way, this could lead to a lot of internal inconsistency. The reason why it didn't need to be grounded in the original trilogy is because it didn't matter if you could believe in the Force and lift an X-Wing. You still need a Jedi to train you. And Obi-Wan and Yoda were the only Jedi left in the universe to train an apprentice, so there was no danger of a universe being oversaturated with Force users.
He could use the Force to influence the midichlorians to create life.
Number 4. Whiny Anakin.
It's all Obi-Wan's fault. He's jealous.
If the original trilogy is primarily Luke's story, then the prequels are Anakin's. All the pieces were there for this to be extremely effective. Watching a beloved character tragically fall into darkness would have been powerful, and would make his redemption near the end of the series all the more fulfilling. But we instead got a whiny, unlikable child and an angry, whiny, and unlikable young adult.
What? No, hold up, let me correct you. We got a lovable, happy, optimistic slave boy who wanted to do good for others, free his fellow slaves, and venture out into the galaxy. He was also quite funny to watch as a fish out of water when he was taken off-world and tossed into the planetary conflict between Naboo and the Trade Federation. With Hayden Christensen, we got an ambitious and emotionally frustrated Jedi apprentice who had trouble dealing with his feelings, and who, like any petulant teen, lacked a certain level of maturity and didn't like being held back. Anakin's whininess, as you'd like to call it, falls in line with the core of his character, his extraordinary ambition, which in and of itself is very unbecoming of a Jedi, which is kind of the point.
Something's happening. I'm not the Jedi I should be. I want more, and I know I shouldn't.
People wouldn't have given a second thought to the portrayal of Anakin by Jake and Hayden if Anakin wasn't the precursor to arguably the most iconic villain of all time. And if they pulled their heads out of their asses and paid attention to who Darth Vader actually was instead of this preconceived notion of what they thought he was and what they wanted him to be, they wouldn't have had a problem with this at all. Vader was once a kid who behaved like a kid. Vader was once a rebellious teenager who behaved like a rebellious teenager, and so on.
What?
We're constantly told about how much he loves Padme and how he's great friends with Obi-Wan, but we never actually see this on screen.
Every single Jedi, including your friend, Obi-Wan Kenobi, is now an enemy of the Republic.
Yeah, I think you need to watch the prequels again.
Pull up, Anakin. Pull up! You know I don't like it when you do that.
Sorry, Master. I forgot you don't like flying.
I don't mind flying, but what you're doing is suicide!
And it's ignorant remarks like this which gave you that horrible like to dislike ratio. You deserve it.
I understand, Master.
Ultimately, the audience is never given the chance to even like our main character, which makes his fall from grace far less interesting or meaningful.
You're not all powerful.
Well, I should be.
Context, 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 context.
Number 3. Too much CGI.
And ignorance once again rearing its ugly head.
It's Queen Amidala herself.
At last, we are getting results.
The original trilogy was incredibly difficult to film, but because they used real sets and locations, it felt real. The setting felt real, the characters felt real, and the story felt real.
Yeah, you do realize that the prequels did all that too. You do realize that, right? The Phantom Menace alone had more practical effects than the entire original trilogy combined. It's just downplayed by fools on the internet to reinforce a stupid misconception and narrative against the movies and the creator to discredit the prequels with this CGI is the devil mentality.
This realism is lacking in the prequels, and one of the main reasons behind this is the overuse of CGI. Everything seems squeaky clean, but it's clear the actors are not interacting with their setting because they aren't actually in the setting.
She says this while Obi-Wan is interacting with the setting. Yeah, the Geonosian pit was an actual set, and the Colosseum it was held in was an actual miniature that was built. Also, who gives if planets like Kamino and Coruscant are squeaky clean? They are futuristic settings with a sleek look to them, and they better be clean since most of the buildings were places of politics and government. The examples I give are the Naboo Palace, which was practical, and shot on location by the way, Naboo's Royal Cruiser, also practical, Padme's apartment, practical, Palpatine's office, which was practical, the Senate Dome, and the Kamino Prime Minister's office, and the Jedi Council halls, all of which were CGI and looked very clean, as they should be given what the places represent. And on a personal note, CGI, practical, who fucking gives a shit? It all comes down to execution. People framed the CGI in the prequels as laziness, and nothing could be further from the truth. The amount of innovation and detail that went into generating it when they didn't even know it would work is astounding. The agenda of the internet is actually backwards to what happened. If the original trilogy was praised for its groundbreaking special effects in the late 70s and early 80s, the prequels should absolutely be commended for their groundbreaking CGI achievements, no matter how much they age.
The action scenes are so full of CGI droids, ships, and armies that it's nearly impossible to follow what's going on. The use of CGI may have made life easier for George Lucas, but it hurt the overall quality of the films.
What's the situation?
You see what I mean? The internet tries to frame it as laziness when that's just blatantly incorrect. It's agenda-driven nonsense. Not to mention, I wanted to go down in history that WatchMojo couldn't comprehend the CGI battles in the prequels. A channel with 20 million subscribers couldn't understand CGI battles in movies which were made to be comprehended by 12-year-olds. Let that sink in. And yeah, you know that weird argument that some people tend to make that Star Wars isn't for kids and that's just a cheap cop-out by George Lucas? Well, that argument works both ways. Because how come kids seemingly understand these simple concepts and set pieces just fine, and some adults who claim to know what they're talking about seemingly don't?
Number 2. Plot holes.
Don't you wonder why they won't make you a Jedi Master?
I wish I knew.
You're right, there are issues with certain points of the prequel's plot. Nobody will deny that they exist. I just know they number nowhere near the amount idiots on the internet like you seem to preach, but do go on.
Sure, the main plot of the Star Wars prequels revolves around Anakin Skywalker turning to the dark side of the Force, and the emergence of the Empire. But between those broad storylines, the films are full of plot holes. The main reason for this is the fact that the plot is unnecessarily convoluted. A major issue in the first film is the blockade of Naboo, but do we ever see the blockade? Does it even matter?
There's the blockade!
Do we ever see the blockade? Does it even matter?
There's the blockade! There's the blockade!
Why are the Jedi unable to sense that the most powerful Sith in the galaxy is literally in the same building as them?
Okay, regarding the blockade, it's absolutely an important part of the Phantom Menace because it's the Trade Federation cutting off trade to a Republic planet due to the Federation wanting tax changes because they facilitate trade. And the Crawl states that they're very greedy. This can be inferred from the movie itself. The blockade is also there to prevent Naboo from calling for help once their planet has been invaded. And the blockade does its job when they try to prevent the escaping Naboo cruiser, which is carrying the Queen, from leaving the planet. People criticize that the blockade is retarded for shooting the transport that's carrying the person they need to sign the treaty. But that's kind of moronic because if the blockade doesn't shoot down or disable the planet escapers, then the blockade isn't doing its job. Is it? After all, what's the point of cutting off the communications and invading the planet if the Viceroy didn't order the blockade to shoot down any escaping ships? Also, the blockade very likely didn't know that the Queen was on the cruiser. The Viceroy sent her to a holding camp not 15 minutes before she was off-world. It's only after the cruiser escapes that he connects the dots, that the Queen never made it to the holding camp, and she must have been on the escaping ship. To support this, you'll also note that the Viceroy doesn't label the Naboo cruiser as the Queen's ship, just a random ship that was most likely carrying the Queen, because she's disappeared on world, and the Federation cannot find her.
How will you explain this invasion to the Senate?
The Queen and I will sign a treaty that will legitimize our occupation here. I have assurances it will be ratified by the Senate.
I will not cooperate.
No, Your Highness. In time, the suffering of your people will persuade you to see our point of view. Commander.
Yes, sir.
Process them.
Captain, take them to Camp 4. Roger, roger.
Your Highness, under the circumstances, I suggest you come to Coruscant with us.
Has she signed the treaty?
She has disappeared, my lord. One Naboo cruiser got past the blockade.
However, the blockade disappearing from the planet of Naboo upon the Queen's return is the questionable part of the movie. And yes, absolutely, I'll agree that Palpatine being able to mask his presence and the dark side cloud in the Jedi's vision should have been fleshed out more. Admittedly, this becomes more of an issue at the end of Episode 2 to midway through Episode 3 because once the war starts, Palpatine has the emergency powers by that point. But up till then, he doesn't have what one could perceive to be an agenda. Like, he doesn't even propose the idea of emergency powers, but he's manipulated people behind the scenes that urge for him to have more power and take more action. I think it's perfectly fine to attribute Palpatine's ability to evade the Jedi's detection to his immense power and knowledge of the dark side. But so much of the story hinges upon this that it's warranted more explanation. It's referenced a lot through episodes 2 and 3 that the dark side clouds their vision.
Master Yoda, do you think it will really come to war?
The dark side clouds everything. Impossible to see. The future is. The shroud of the dark side has fallen. Begun. The Clone War has.
I told you that the Republic was now under the control of the Dark Lord of the Sith.
No, that's not possible. The Jedi would be aware of it.
The dark side of the Force has clouded their vision, my friend.
And the further idea that the Jedi ability to use the Force is diminishing. It's established very early on in the very first scene where Yoda says, the dark side has clouded everything. But an idea that that's important and that complex really needs to be said a couple times. And the fact that as the dark side grows, it clouds their vision. They're very concerned that people find out that they're losing their abilities, that it wouldn't help the situation of the separatist movement and all the other things that are going on. Because it's a very tense situation, and the Jedi are completely outnumbered in terms of trying to keep control of the situation.
On the Blu-ray commentary, George Lucas has said that the dark side is essentially the Jedi's kryptonite, which doesn't allow them to see. We are given an explanation in the films, but it's because it lacks depth that the audience has trouble digesting this concept.
Heck, why is there a child-sized helmet in the ship Anakin flies in the first film?
How is that a plot hole, you dumb bitch? And just to be clear, it isn't a child-sized helmet in the cockpit. Do you see how big that thing is on Anakin's face? The real plot hole is why is Anakin at the battle in the first place without a connective scene? That's the real issue people, myself included, have with this sequence.
In a series this exposition heavy, how can there be so many plot holes?
I don't know.
You named like 2 plot holes, one of which wasn't particularly valid in the way you described, and I'm pretty sure I could find that many with ease in each of the oh-so-precious original trilogy movies.
Before we unveil our number 1 pick, here are some honorable, or in this case, dishonorable mentions.
It appears that the Chancellor is behind everything, including the war.
The Jedi aren't idiots. Their vision was clouded and they had their suspicions, but without any concrete proof, they can't act on a man who has the highest position of government in the Republic.
The dark side of the Force has clouded their vision, my friend. Hundreds of senators are now under the influence of a Sith Lord called Darth Sidious.
I don't believe you. Do you believe what Count Dooku said about Sidious controlling the Senate? It doesn't feel right.
Join the dark side. Dooku has. Lies, deceit, creating mistrust are his ways now.
Nevertheless, I feel we should keep a closer eye on the Senate.
I agree.
And by the end of the episode, he has emergency powers which allows him to perform actions that far exceed his ordinary bounds. And to reiterate, Palpatine hasn't been pushing for power. He's distanced himself from the clones, the Kaminoans, the Geonosians, and the droids so well that you wouldn't suspect he's behind anything.
I will not let this republic that has stood for 1,000 years be split in two. Master Yoda, do you think it will really come to war?
The Senate will never approve the use of clones before the Separatist attack.
This is a crisis. The Senate must vote the Chancellor emergency powers. He can then approve the creation of an army.
But what senator would have the courage to propose such a radical amendment?
Misa propose that the Senate immediately emergency powers to the Supreme Chancellor.
It is with great reluctance that I have agreed to this calling. Power you give me, I will lay down when this crisis has abated.
Are you all right?
Yes, thanks to your 2 Jedi Knights. They killed Count Dooku, but General Grievous has escaped once again.
Especially since the Senate, again, keeps pushing for him to have more power. He's not asking for it.
What's wrong then?
The Senate is expected to vote more executive powers to the Chancellor today. Is that bad? It will make it easier for us to end this war.
Anakin, our allegiance is to the Senate, not to its leader. He's managed to stay in office long after his term has expired.
The Senate demanded that he stay long.
Yes, but use your feelings, Anakin. Something is out of place.
In the eyes of the Republic, the Chancellor is doing his best to give his reluctantly accepted powers back to the Senate as quickly as possible. In the Republic's eyes, he's a saint. The only reason the Jedi suspect him at all is because Dooku let his information slip to Obi-Wan of a Sith manipulating the Senate. The reason why Dooku let this information slip in the first place is because Obi-Wan was close to Qui-Gon Jinn, who was Dooku's former apprentice.
It's a great pity that our paths have never crossed before, Obi-Wan. Qui-Gon always spoke very highly of you. Could use his help right now.
Qui-Gon Jinn would never join you.
Don't be so sure, my young Jedi. You forget that he was once my apprentice, just as you were once his. He knew all about the corruption in the Senate, but he would never have gone along with it if he had learned the truth as I have.
The truth?
The truth.
Dooku does this in an attempt to undermine Sidious, a classic Sith trait that keeps to the rule of 2, which was outlined in The Phantom Menace.
You must join me, Obi-Wan, and together we will destroy the Sith.
Join me, and I will complete your training. With our combined strength, we can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy.
And Dooku does this while Obi-Wan was at his mercy. It was essentially a join me or die scenario.
I will never join you, Dooku.
It may be difficult to secure your release.
And also, just a side note, but this also helps explain why Qui-Gon Jinn was the rebellious Jedi that he was in The Phantom Menace, as he was shown to defy the Council at almost every turn. Considering who his Jedi Master was in Count Dooku, who ultimately left the Order and is now the leading activist against the Republic, this speaks wonders about the relationship between them. But back on point, in Attack of the Clones, the Jedi were alerted to Sidious. The Jedi then spent the duration of the Clone Wars investigating this thread. So then, by Revenge of the Sith, the Jedi higher-ups suspect Palpatine, but they cannot prove it. There was some further context for what Palpatine's recently elected additional powers would grant him, which was direct control of the Jedi Council. This was cut from the beginning of the scene where Anakin is appointed by Palpatine to the Council on his behalf. Again, back to my point about inference, this additional information on the Blu-ray just confirms what we pretty much already knew based on both Palpatine's actions and how the Jedi reacted.
Anakin, this afternoon, the Senate is going to call on me to take direct control of the Jedi Council. The Senate is too unfocused to conduct a war. This will bring a quick end to things.
I agree, but the Council may not see it that way.
There are times when we must all endure adjustments to the Constitution in the name of security.
With all due respect, sir, the Council is in no mood for more constitutional amendments.
Thank you, my friend. But in this case, I have no choice. This war must be won. Anakin, I've known you since you were a small boy. I've advised you when I could. You fought many battles the Jedi Council thought were lost. And you saved my life. It's upsetting to me to see that the Council doesn't seem to fully appreciate your talents. Don't you wonder why you've been kept off the Council?
My time will come when I'm older and, I suppose, wiser.
Age is not a good measure of ability. I think they see something in you they fear. They see your future, and they know your power will be too strong for them to control. They see you as a threat to their power.
I've sensed that.
I hope you trust me, Anakin.
Of course.
There was a front part of this scene where it's a little bit more explicit that Palpatine is in direct control over the Council and making Anakin his representative. It's now implied, but it's never stated that clearly.
Yes, Palpatine controlling the Council was very much implied, but it wasn't just cut because it was redundant and for time purposes, but also because it was linked to an additional scene that also refers to this explicit detail of Palpatine directly controlling the Council. And in addition to that, it directly flies in the face of the idiotic Jedi sentiment that several critics seem to share. Fun fact, I saw this deleted scene after I wrote this part of the video. I own the Blu-ray of Revenge of the Sith, and this scene was featured on the DVD, and it confirms what I already inferred from the movie, about the Jedi already suspecting Palpatine, despite him being adored by the Senate and the Republic, and having done so much to distance himself from the incriminating evidence against him. To quickly summarize, he wasn't suspected during Attack of the Clones by the Jedi, or anyone for that matter, but in the period of the Clone Wars leading up to Revenge of the Sith, he has gained more and more power, become more and more loved by the Republic, but this chain of events have left the Jedi suspicious of him, and his taking control of the Council with Anakin was essentially the final straw for them to act on their suspicions, but they needed proof. Anyway, take a look at the scene.
Moving to take control of the Jedi Council, the Chancellor is.
There is a massive shift in the Force. We all feel it.
He should be removed from office.
Arrested?
On theories such as these, speculation is all we have. Proof we need before taking this to the Council.
The proof will come when Grievous is gone.
Great care we must take.
As you can see, the Jedi Council already had it in their heads that Palpatine was potentially a Sith, linked to the Sith, or he was potentially corrupted. And yes, this scene was cut out for time purposes, however, no doubt you picked up on several instances where this scene is echoed throughout the film of Revenge of the Sith. That's because while this was all vital exposition, you can still gain pretty much all of this information from the movie's final cut, except for the explicit remark about the Jedi Council, which again was very much implied. Because rather than reserve an explicit scene for these important plot points, they were reworked into other scenes of greater importance with Anakin himself. Here, you'll see what I mean.
Moving to take control of the Jedi Council, the Chancellor is.
The Senate is expected to vote more executive powers to the Chancellor today.
I'm depending on you.
For what? I don't understand.
To be the eyes, ears, and voice of the Republic. Anakin, I'm appointing you to be my personal representative on the Jedi Council.
If the Council elects its own members, they'll never accept this.
I think they will. They need you.
Anakin, our allegiance is to the Senate, not to its leader, who has managed to stay in office long after his term has expired.
There is a massive shift in the Force. We all feel it.
Be careful of your friend, Palpatine.
Be careful of what?
He has requested your presence.
What for?
He would not say.
He didn't inform the Council. That's unusual, isn't it?
All of this is unusual, and it's making me feel uneasy.
The Senate demanded that he stay longer.
Yes, but use your feelings, Anakin. Something is out of place.
General Kenobi has made contact with General Grievous, and we have begun our attack.
Thank you, Commander. Anakin, deliver this report to the Chancellor. His reaction will give us a clue to his intentions.
Yes, Master.
I sense a plot to destroy the Jedi. Dark side of the Force surrounds the Chancellor. He should be removed from office.
Arrested?
If he does not give up his emergency powers after the destruction of Grievous, he should be removed from office.
The Jedi Council would have to take control of the Senate in order to secure a peaceful transition.
On theories such as these, speculation is all we have. Proof we need before taking this to the Council.
Why didn't the Council give me this assignment when we were in session?
This assignment is not to be on record.
Why are you asking this of me?
The Council is asking you.
Anakin did not take to his new assignment with much enthusiasm.
It's very dangerous putting them together. The proof will come when Grievous is gone.
Great care we must take. To a dark place this line of thought will carry us. Great care we must take.
I use this deleted scene as a reference to confirm that the Jedi had their suspicions of Palpatine potentially being linked to the Sith. But the bureaucracy they served demanded proof before they acted, which is very ironic since that very bureaucracy branded them as traitors. Again, all of the pieces from that deleted scene weren't removed entirely. They are in fact in there in the final cut of the film and placed into several scenes that are more focused on Anakin since the story revolves around him. Seeing these pieces of information through his eyes gives the audience what they need to know, whilst keeping the film and the plot firmly on track, maximizing the runtime, and utilizing inference, as previously discussed, very well, allowing the audience to piece together the exposition, the timeline, the characters, and their motives before the turning point of the film. Also, 2 extra things. The reason I'm glad this scene was cut out is because it makes way more sense that in the timeline, once Obi-Wan has already left and engaged Grievous in combat, that the Council only then opts to remove Palpatine from office. Once Grievous has been dispatched and after Windu senses the dark side surrounding Palpatine.
There's a massive shift in the Force. We all feel it.
He should be removed from office.
Arrested?
I sense a plot to destroy the Jedi. The dark side of the Force surrounds the Chancellor.
If he does not give up his emergency powers after the destruction of Grievous, he should be removed from office.
This move on behalf of the Jedi makes far more sense as a hasty decision out of fear due to this recent revelation in the Force.
Remember back to your early teachings. All who gain power are afraid to lose it, even the Jedi.
Rather than something premeditated over time. And not only that, but up till this point in the movie, the Jedi had felt the dark side clouding their vision. But they couldn't tell where it was originating from during Attack of the Clones and throughout Revenge of the Sith. But it makes way more sense that the Jedi would sense something coming from Palpatine, since he's just about ready to make his move against them. I refuse to believe that that's a coincidence, when stacked up against the timeline. And as we know, the next time Windu speaks to Anakin, he confirms the suspicions about Palpatine, while he and half of the Jedi Council were already on their way to take control of the Senate.
We just received word that Obi-Wan has destroyed General Grievous. We're on our way to make sure the Chancellor returns emergency power back to the Senate.
He won't give up his power. I've just learned a terrible truth. I think Chancellor Palpatine is a Sith Lord.
A Sith Lord?
Yes, the one we've been looking for.
How do you know this?
He knows the ways of the Force. He's been trained to use the dark side.
Are you sure?
Absolutely.
And our worst fears have been realized.
And trying to do so could easily be construed as treason, especially with Palpatine having so much power. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what he orchestrates in the end. Their suspicions are the very reason they send Anakin to spy on him. They just don't realize that they are playing right into Palpatine's hands. And that's not bringing up the fact that the war was meant to act as a distraction for the Jedi anyway, to take up resources and keep the Jedi's focus primarily elsewhere, and spread them thin, which is why they were so vulnerable when Order 66 was carried out. I could go on, but the Jedi weren't idiots. They were arrogant, blinded, and hindered by bureaucracy.
Palpatine is the Sith Lord we've been looking for.
Well, first off, they didn't cause re-edits in the original trilogy. That was George Lucas on his own. And secondly, there were plenty of good re-edits, like The Emperor and The Empire Strikes Back. So just saying the re-edits were bad is painting with far too broad a stroke, and it isn't the fault of the prequels, especially since the edits of the original trilogy started before the prequel trilogy was even released. Oh, and by the way, the music you're listening to in the finale of episode 6 is also a re-edit, and most people consider it an improvement. And yes, once again, it had nothing to do with the prequels, just FYI.
He is the chosen one. He will bring balance.
Yeah, Anakin's birth was very likely inspired by the Virgin Mary. I'm a Christian, and I wasn't offended. As a matter of fact, who gives a shit? But also there's nothing wrong with taking concepts and tropes and repurposing them for something different. The Chosen One is a well-known fantasy trope. Anakin's virgin birth was inspired by the birth of Jesus Christ, but it was repurposed. As a matter of fact, George uses Anakin's unusual circumstances surrounding his birth, as well as his prophecy, as something resembling the coming of the Antichrist, a man destined to bring about doom and slaughter, who would eventually bring out the balance after returning to the light. But you can feel free to make your own interpretation. That's what I've personally always seen Anakin's virgin birth and prophecy resembling.
Number 1. Jar Jar Binks.
Yeah, it would make sense at this point that the number one point on the list would quite possibly be the stupidest.
You're thinking, people gonna die?
Well, yeah. Jar Jar Binks is arguably one of the most disliked and offensive characters in the history of film.
Well, I'm not going to argue with the degree that the character is hated, I just think he's disliked for very stupid reasons, and honestly, to an embarrassing degree. I personally loved Jar Jar as a kid, as I was meant to, and I still like him as an adult. As for offensive characters, Jar Jar doesn't even come fucking close. Firstly, he's been labeled as a racist representation of Jamaicans, which is an extreme stretch, by the way. And secondly, Jamaicans must have extremely thin skin if they were offended by an alien water amphibian with rabbit ears that talks like an alien that isn't fluid in the English language.
All your characterizations are quite definite, aren't they? I mean, where did this one come from?
The movie is pretty neutral. It is in outer space. These are aliens. How in the world you could take an orange amphibian and say that he's a Jamaican? I mean, even the idea of taking his ears and calling them dreadlocks is kind of a strange stretch as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's completely absurd. And what that came out of ultimately was there is a group of fans of the films that don't like comic sidekicks. They want the films to be tough and like Terminator, and they want to be, you know, real guy movies, and they get very, very upset and very opinionated about anything that has anything to do with being childlike, which the movies are for children, but they don't want to admit that, and or a comic sidekick, because they don't want comedy in these movies. And in the first film, they absolutely hated R2 and 3PO. Now Jar Jar is getting accused of the same thing.
Something tells me that you and the rest of the internet don't speak for the majority.
Some critics claimed that George Lucas was clearly using the character to appeal to children and to sell merchandise. But others took it a step further, saying the Gungan was in fact a racist caricature.
Also, here's another fun fact that will debunk some of the racism arguments. A large chunk of Jar Jar's mannerisms, including how the character moves and spoke, started with the casting of Ahmed Best.
Oh no! In terms of Jar Jar's performance, it really all started with Ahmed Best.
He would play the scene with the actors, so I blocked it out and I directed the actors and Ahmed the way I wanted the scene to be played. I hired Ahmed because he is very physical and he can act with his body.
You kind of come over here next to the Jedi.
So we have Ahmed, motion capture applied to the Jar Jar model, but we haven't done any of the ears or the hands or them yet.
There's never been a real comic character in any of the Star Wars movies, like just outright comic. The character of Jar Jar, he was banished from his world because he was clumsy. He just didn't fit in with the other Gungans of his world. And I think everybody remembers when they were that kid who just didn't fit in. And I know I was that weird kid who didn't fit into any group. I think all those kids and all those, people who feel like they don't fit in will identify with Jar Jar. He wants to fit in and he wants to be with everybody else and he wants to be good, but he just can't help it. He's just clumsy. You relate to the world, even though these are different creatures and different people. Something about it makes you relate to it. Something about it makes you feel for the characters.
Some fan theories suggest that Jar Jar was originally written as a major antagonist of the series, but the overwhelming negative response to the character caused Lucas to scrap those plans. Regardless, the Jar Jar we're left with is the perfect symbol for why the prequels are so despised by so many Star Wars fans.
Yeah, the character proves that some Star Wars fans have the most retarded fucking metric for what makes a good product. I can't believe they're actually touting the Darth Jar Jar theory as an actual possibility. Like, I've pretended to buy into it before just to be a good sport. We love Darth Jar Jar, but he's a fucking fanfiction for goodness sake. And yeah, likely George had bigger plans for Jar Jar, which he decided to scrap due to the unwarranted fan hatred for the character. And those people can hate Jar Jar all they want, but the fact is that, like it or not, Jar Jar was more important to this saga and got more shit done and has a bigger through line as a character than Boba fucking Fett. And that's despite the fact that George catered to their wishes and lessened the character's role in episodes 2 and 3. But still, some of those people will condemn Jar Jar and suck off Boba Fett, which is just fucking baffling to me. Nah, there's no clear bias and utterly fucking retarded metric for assessing quality amongst some Star Wars fans. That's just ridiculous. And you'll notice, unlike the mainstream, when I call out Star Wars fans, I take the time not to generalize. I try to make it very clear that I'm distinguishing between specific groups of fans, or fanatics rather, that are a part of a greater whole. I don't want to be lumped in with the people who love The Last Jedi, and I certainly don't want to be lumped in with the people who despise Jar Jar Binks and Child Anakin. Lastly, regarding Jar Jar's antics throughout The Phantom Menace, his humour is meant to be slapstick for the demographic of children, but there are multiple times that his humorous scenes are used to provide secondary information, including a deeper insight to the characters and some very clever foreshadowing. The examples I point to are the following. When Jar Jar first meets Anakin and he tells him how to shut off the droids, this is very subtle foreshadowing for the final battle when Anakin blows up the control ship and the Gungans celebrate by pushing over the lifeless battle droids on the fields of Naboo. Another example I point to is when Jar Jar gets his tongue caught in the energy binder on Anakin's pod racer and gets his hand caught in the turbine. No one opts to help Jar Jar or take his situation seriously other than Padme, who with context on the second viewing of the film is the Queen of Naboo. And she is the one who opts to help this clumsy, bumbling imbecile of a creature unjam his fingers, preventing their potential amputation. This says a lot about Padme's humility as a monarch and her compassion as a human being, as well as acting as some clever foreshadowing for the final act of the film, when Queen Amidala makes an alliance with the Gungans, and they as a collective come to her aid. Finally, we have the scene where Jar Jar is licking apples off the table in a very obnoxious manner to the disgust of all of the characters. He does this while Qui-Gon and Anakin discuss pod racing and the necessity of Jedi-like reflexes to race pods. While this is happening, Jar Jar's antics allow us to observe those very same reflexes that Qui-Gon was talking about when he catches Jar Jar's tongue in mid-air. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to all of Jar Jar's scenes. Some of them are there simply only for the jokes. But you'll find those scenes only last like a second or two, unless there's an actual purpose behind what is being shown on screen. This is why I get extremely pissed off with films like Iron Man 3 that are littered with please laugh now jokes that not only serve no purpose, but also ruin the tone of the scene or come at the expense of the characters. And Jar Jar Binks is very much purposeful as a slapstick comedy character for more than just the jokes. And if you think I'm pulling this straight out of my ass, I promise you I'm not. Foreshadowing is a staple of Lucas's work. Anyone who's done half an hour of research into these films would know this. The man loves to foreshadow, to echo his own work. And if you pay close attention, you can find every single Star Wars film drenched in foreshadowing. Quick side note, if you're watching one of the original 6 Star Wars films, chances are if you come across something that you think is foreshadowing, 9 out of 10 times when it comes to the Star Wars movies, it is.
Your point is well seen. This way, hurry!
Do you agree with our picks? Check out these other great clips from WatchMojo and subscribe for new videos every day.
And finished. Well, we finally made it through that steaming hot excrement of a video made by one of YouTube's oldest and most useless fossils, that still manages to fester on this site and continue to perpetuate a never-ending cycle of shit. WatchMojo is just a prime example of the mainstream on YouTube not knowing what the fuck they're talking about when it comes to the prequels, and Star Wars as a whole, to be perfectly honest. But especially the prequels, and not to mention the OG himself. They just want to make some quick cash, just like dozens of other morons on this site, established or otherwise, who wanted to make a quick dollar and regurgitate a bunch of points they didn't fully understand, or straight up lied about from another useless fossil on the internet that didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. And most certainly had an agenda to feed people's displeasure back to them with a bunch of shittily written arguments.
Thumbs way down.
You didn't like it?
No, I think I deserve a public apology from George Lucas.
Or some film snob philosophical bullshit they found in a filmmaking for dummies book somewhere that wasn't abided by, and thus it's either a flaw or the director was stupid, when in actuality, they don't know jack shit about filmmaking to begin with themselves.
I want you to tell me who the main character of The Phantom Menace was.
You serious?
It's impossible for me to review this movie without giving a humongous thank you and shout out to Red Letter Media, because their review for The Phantom Menace is quite possibly my favorite movie review of all time. They said everything that's to be said, plus a whole bunch of things no one else ever thought of. But as you watch the movie, I challenge you to figure out who the main character of this movie is. You can't. It's not Qui-Gon, it's not Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it's not Anakin. Who's the main character of this movie? Liam Neeson gets top billing, so maybe Qui-Gon is? In a way, it almost seems like Qui-Gon's the main character of the movie, but why would you do that? Who the hell is Qui-Gon?
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since my son. Yes, before I start this breakdown, I have to address the big red letter in the room. The Mr. Plinkett reviews by Red Letter Media are probably the best analysis of the Star Wars prequels on the internet, and unfortunately for me, they are incredibly in-depth. None of these characters have character traits. I think the only reason people are moved by Qui-Gon's death is because Qui-Gon gets way more screen time. He's closest to being the main character. There's no main character. The characters that are in this movie don't have any traits or personalities.
I want you to tell me who the main character of The Phantom Menace was.
The prequel hate has essentially become Chinese whispers at this point. The criticisms certainly exist, but far fewer than the internet would have you believe. For many of you who are new to this series, the hatred and arguments, if you can call them that, in most cases on YouTube, and the mainstream article outlets come down to things like CGI bad, practical good, and politics boring, get to the space battles. Even though, as previously explained, those are misconceptions that are just factually incorrect. And no, that's not a strawman, and I'm not being uncharitable. This video by WatchMojo is living proof of that. The same goes for Star Wars Only, I Hate Everything, Nostalgia Critic, Chris Stockman, who you bet your ass I'll get to soon enough, and especially Cosmonaut Variety Hour, just to name but a few. And this is just another video to add to those we have altogether executed along the way. If this video of WatchMojo proves anything, is that most people do not hate the prequels, because the ones that actually paid attention from the time of release are actually speaking out. They are being vocal. They aren't walking back on their words because of Disney.
Now, many people debate whether or not the sequels helped us open our eyes to the prequels, but personally, I feel like a lot of people are only saying good things about the prequels because they just want to spite the sequels.
It's because of Disney that these people are now saying, "We told you so."
I don't like this sale, as I belong to the small but vociferous group who believed George Lucas was doing just fucking fine the way he was. Oh no, Jar Binks was annoying! Movie ruined! You know who else is fucking annoying? The Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. He's eternally Dick Van Dyke the fuck around, tripping over his own shoelaces, pandering to children for comedic effect. Sound familiar? Yeah. Is Wizard of Oz still a peerless cinematic classic? Fuck you, Red Letter Media. Bite the veiniest corner of my cock.
Fuck you, Razor. You're just being a contrarian. Oh my god, Razor's lost it. Unsubscribe. J.J. Abrams is a tender lover. Absorbing the acrimony, attuned to the fact that I'd gone on record with a prediction all the available data suggested absolutely would occur, I uttered the immortal words, "You will beg for George Lucas before the end," and I waited. And then The Last Jedi happened. Fuck you, I was right, fuck you, I was right, fuck you, I was right!
The people who are actually walking back on their words regarding the prequels and its creator are the ones who realize what absolute shallow fools they were, and don't want to be retrospectively looked at like an out-of-touch jackass. I promise you, it's no accident that I haven't mentioned or referenced Jeremy Johns in this video, because he's one of the few, if not the only, high-profile movie reviewer who took a prior stance against George Lucas and the prequels, who has actually shown intellectual honesty, humility, and some bloody integrity.
Alright, so the big news hitting the internet that everybody is talking about is the fact that Disney has bought out Lucasfilm. That's right, George Lucas has signed over Lucasfilm to Disney. Disney, who, as far as I'm concerned, is unofficially competing with Google for world dominance. Just saying, it's crazy. And funny enough, this news has gotten mixed reactions. I've seen comments, videos, and reactions where people are like, "Oh dude, what? Star Wars is gonna die, it's dead, oh, the worst decision ever, it's gonna die." Really? Have you seen the prequels? That already happened. Star Wars fell from grace off of the pedestal that it was on in the 80s over 10 years ago. So do I consider the fact that Disney now owns Lucasfilm a good thing? Not necessarily. I consider it a great thing. Because ever watch a Star Wars movie and just think to yourself, you're like, it would be really cool to see how this director would direct a Star Wars movie, or how this writer would write a Star Wars movie? Now we live in a world where that's not only a possibility, it is an inevitability. inevitability, regardless of your sentiment of the prequels, and I do think time has validated the prequels. In the eyes of the fandom, anyway. You might not like the prequels. I prefer the original trilogy myself, but in the eyes of the fandom as a whole, the prequels have been validated through time. Because dialogue aside, to its core, that there was something there. It all just came at the right time for me. All of this has. I rewatched the prequels. I watched Bram Stoker's Dracula, which after watching Bram Stoker's Dracula, it's like, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Like, oh my God, that's what he was trying to do with Anakin. Anakin is Dracula, essentially. This legendary war soldier, and then the woman he loves dies, and he just snaps and gives himself over to being the right hand of the devil, essentially. In the end, he's a victim of his own choices. And after seeing Bram Stoker's Dracula recently, I understood, I got it. Would have liked that to have happened in episode 2, and episode 3 just been Vader being a badass wrecking Jedi. But I digress, the concept hit me and I understood. In the end, I feel like Disney was just two-faced with George Lucas because they wanted to make a quick buck, and they did, they made a quick buck. Well played, but you're dicks for it. Fact is, who can blame him? Who can blame him for selling it? Who can blame Disney for fucking him over like that? I mean, shit, assholes like me got on camera, said, George Lucas and his prequels, yeah, Disney's gonna do their own thing. It's gonna be awesome. We paved the way for them. We validated them. We gave them the green light. I mean, I can't speak for everybody. I feel like I did, though. Anyhow, George Lucas, I'm sorry.
Instead of trying to grasp at straws to reaffirm his stance on a narrative that was misplaced.
Life is life. And here is a big fundamental thing about life. You get new data, you process that new data, and then your mindset kind of changes. I've had a couple years to process these new Star Wars movies. It's just what I see. I get the feeling if I'm jumping to a conclusion, and I might be, reviewers out there will review a movie or view a movie a certain way, and if the perception on it changes, they're not allowed to say it. They have to, above all other things, stand by and defend their initial outlook on the movie. Life's too short for that shit. Fuck that. You get new data all the time. You process that new data, come to a different conclusion. Different outlook. I'm gonna blow your mind right now. Any and every movie reviewer out there that you watch has changed their mind about a multitude of movies, but they can't say it, so they don't. Have fun with that, truth.
In addition to that, you now have disingenuous or straight up ignorant cunts who are behaving like absolute pussies and trying to paint the opposition as something they are not, because they are too scared to engage in discussion. Such attempts to avoid discussion are the following. People only like the prequels because of their nostalgia. Or, now that the sequels aren't what the fans wanted them to be, people are saying that the prequels are masterpieces. And my personal favorite, and the quickest way to prove to me that you need a slap of reality right across the face, just because the sequels suck doesn't suddenly make the prequels good. When all that does is show what an unbelievable ignorant retard you are. You're not even trying to understand the opposition. You're ignoring hordes and hordes of legitimate arguments that contradict your extremely narrow perspective that was most likely fed to you by online idiots. This is akin to people up in arms in outrage about The Last Jedi and having the mainstream label the fans as a bunch of racist misogynists who don't want diversity in their movies. They don't want to understand the opposition. It's simply easier to paint them as something they are not, so that they don't have to have a discussion about the facts of the matter. Whether it's to push their own agenda for a number of different reasons, or because they don't want to open themselves up and reevaluate their extremely narrow perspective that they've had reinforced and spoon-fed back to them for potentially over a decade at this point. Most amusing of all is seeing some people actually attempt to reevaluate the prequels, but will specifically go back to reevaluate the prequels with the mindset of, I need to prove this film is still bad. Like they're bitter about the positive reception the prequels have had, and are still actively trying to reinforce a narrative, be it the internet's or their own. And so they'll take this approach instead of neutrally watching the movies. Their reevaluation is clouded by their own bias, driven by agenda. They might discover some more flaws, sure, but they'll miss elements of the script that will explain away those flaws, be it character consistency, lore, world building, timeline, or they'll just straight up miss the director's intent as a result. But also, these same people, after their reevaluation, will partially concede, saying that they admit it's not as bad as people say it was, or not as bad as they remember. But for whatever reason, be it to reaffirm their prior perspective, or out of fear of being discredited by the incident, will refrain from labeling the prequels as good or even average, or at least to the quality standard of your average Marvel movie. I point to Cosmonaut Variety Hour as the most classic example.
And now all of a sudden people are saying the prequels are good? What the fuck happened? I've seen so many people unironically defend these movies.
Hello there.
And then turn around and shit on other bad movies like Suicide Squad or Batman v Superman, even though they all share the same exact issues. Overly expensive movies with bad effects and worse writing. And way too many people are saying that the prequels are redeemed because they're better than the new movies. What kills me is when people say these movies are good and these aren't. Oh, at least the prequels had some original ideas. Who the fuck says shit like this? Original ideas aren't enough to make a movie good. If you thought this was going to be a video about me praising the prequels, then I'm sorry. You probably don't know me very well. Maybe we can be friends in another life. Today, I'm going to try and bring these movies back down a peg because I hate them, and when people disagree with me, I feel uncomfortable. In the way, you're going to see classic characters acting stupid, acting out of character, but no, remember, these are the movies that are better than the new movies. Remember, guys, these movies understand Star Wars. This is it, guys. The last prequel, and this is the one that people say is the good one. And I will admit that it's not nearly as bad as the other two, but it's still not good.
Probably an even better example are the widely known collective of 3 brain cells from Sardonicast, consisting of Ralph the Movie Maker, I Hate Everything, who was the subject of episode 1 for this series, by the way, and YMS. 3 high-profile established channels who needed a flavor of the month for material on their podcast. So they decided to go back and re-evaluate the prequels in an attempt to find out if their prior negative perspective on the matter was misplaced.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, George Lucas became a hack and some people talked about it.
Hey,
this is Sardonicast, everybody. What do you mean? What do you mean don't say
That's
that?
mean?
I just said it.
He's not a hack.
Yeah, sure. This is Adam from Your Movie Sucks.
I'm Ralph from youtube.com/Ralph the Movie Maker. This is where the
And
fun
I'm Alex
begins.
from IHG. That's it, just keep going. Just keep quoting.
And here's what they had to say, and it basically sums up what I'm talking about regarding the mainstream climate surrounding the prequels in response to the positive reception they have gained in recent years.
Speaking of intellectual properties that Disney purchased for billions of dollars, Star Wars.
Nice.
We watched
But this is before they
Star
bought
Wars
it.
movies.
This is when George Lucas owned it.
Yeah, the high point of Star Wars. You want to introduce this is the recommendation. You want to
Yeah,
introduce
this is
it?
my movie.
Yeah.
It's a better point. So, spoilers for Star Wars Episode 3.
And
Revenge
1
of
and
the
2, I guess. I mean,
I think, and 1 and 2. All of them. We're going to spoil all of them.
The
but I'm
prequels,
sure you've
basically,
all...
yeah.
when I started watching I watched the third movie first, because that was the one that I was for sure going to watch, and I watched all 3 of them.
Yeah.
And I was about an hour and 20 minutes through it. I was having a miserable fucking time, and I was just like, God fucking damn it, Ralph, what did you expect? Why are we watching this? Like, why are we watching? Oh yeah, it's been long enough that we feel like, oh yeah, maybe we'll give it a second chance. Well, there's a reason why we don't remember anything about them, because nothing fucking happens. Yeah, it's a movie where most of what's happening is just dumb political bullshit. I'm talking about the trilogy in general, I guess. But even the third one, like, it's just nothing happens until like the very end. And I can see why people like the third one the most, because something happens at the end. All the other movies, it's like you watch through the whole fucking thing. It's like, what? Nothing happened. This entire 2+ hour movie.
Feel mostly pointless.
Oh yeah, not to mention there's this little gem.
No tone, like I don't know what I'm supposed to be. Yeah, it's tone deaf. I don't know what I'm supposed to be feeling for most of it.
The tone is boring.
Most of it feels like kind of an objective view of like the history of this galaxy that doesn't exist.
It's a lore movie. It's a lore movie for nerds.
Yeah.
Star Wars is a lore movie for nerds.
Oh my god. Oh, that says so much about YMS. I think I need to quote that. Like, Star Wars is a lore movie.
That's a good one.
Star Wars is a lore movie for nerds. It's a
world
lore
building
movie.
is overrated. If you world build, you're a fucking nerd.
It's almost like if I want to tell my story in a universe that's completely different from our own, then I got to explain shit.
No, shut up, you fucking dweeb.
All right. I guess I'll just sign my life away to Universal Studios and make corporate fucking movies for that trash fire of a company. Thanks for killing my originality, Mando.
Don't talk about Transformers like that.
Thinking of Paramount, but yeah.
But what shocked me the most when I watched this podcast, and what was very telling to me, is when YMS said this.
So you were talking about like the pacing and the editing, and what I was going to mention is that when I was about an hour and 20 minutes through the movie having a miserable fucking time, like I wanted to die, basically. My roommate comes in and is like, yo, how long are you through this movie? And so I press the button on the remote, like the display button, just to show like how long we are through it. But I accidentally pressed the audio track button, and it changes to the described video for the visually impaired, where basically somebody narrated every action in the movie so that blind people can listen to it and get kind of the same experience. And then I just left it on. And then I watched the whole rest of the movie like that. I wouldn't have done it if it was a movie that I hadn't seen before. Like, I respect the podcast enough, but I've seen these movies already, so I finished the movie like that. It was a much more enjoyable experience. Not just because it was funny, but because you actually get a lot more context. Like, they say what planet you're on every time. It's like, cut to this planet, and they say every character's name. Like, and that's why I was able to watch the other two, because otherwise I wouldn't have. I literally would not have, because they're just so fucking boring. Hilarious. But it was so much more entertaining watching it with described video, and it was. I got to hear every character's name several times. I found it hilarious that Anakin's mom is named Shmi. Yeah, Shmi.
Yeah, Shmi.
Shmi.
So this guy who made a 2.5-hour Kimber the White Lion video needed a narrator to comprehend what are essentially children's movies when he decided to watch them in the order of Revenge of the Sith, then The Phantom Menace, then Attack of the Clones, and by watching this episode of Sardonicast, by the end you will wonder if he's even watched these movies at all. For a full breakdown of what was said, you can find it on my podcast, AI Core, number 27. I'd highly suggest you check it out so that you can see everything in context. But allow me to be absolutely clear, it's not the fault of the movies, Adam, if you made a conscious effort to watch them out of order and were not paying attention, despite having a fucking narrator guiding you through it. You're perfectly fine doing those quickie videos you do on topics you have no vested interest in, but still want to discuss. Unlike your universally praised Kimber the White Lion video, in which your investment was very apparent. But it's very evident that you and the other two stooges certainly had an agenda with the prequels, a narrative to sell, a position to reinforce, and your take on the matter suffered tremendously, and to an embarrassing degree I might add, because of this. And you obviously didn't expect any scrutiny, which goes to show just how out of touch you guys are. If you want to discuss, critique, or commentate on the prequels, be my guest. But if you're criticizing something, you owe it to both the art and the artist, by all semblance of ethics that exist, to pay attention, and to do so neutrally and honestly. Otherwise, you are going to be held accountable for the things you say by people who give a shit. And if you don't want to be held accountable for the inaccurate or uncharitable things you say, then don't say them. Objective quality exists, objective flaws exist, but everyone has their own metric for measuring quality. And for some reason, the prequels still have this very bizarre metric attached to them by the majority of the internet. Like, this is very hard to quantify exactly because everyone's metric is different and everyone ranks quality different to their personal preference, despite the existence of objectivity. But when it comes to the prequels, I honestly think it straight up comes down to people being afraid. Being afraid to discredit themselves because it's been the mainstream climate for so long that if you've worked hard for your credibility, content creators feel slapping an even slightly positive rating on something as popular as Star Wars and has also been so publicly maligned in the past as, say, The Phantom Menace, they fear that they will lose a lot of their hard work, especially if they've already gone out of their way to shame the product so publicly in the past, and especially if they've made a living out of it. Even the people who have tried to praise the prequels in recent years, they'll say something good about the prequels. They'll say that it has improved in quality in their eyes, but they'll always attach some weird fucking asterisk to the end of it. It reminds me of that quote from Game of Thrones, that anything someone says before the word but doesn't count. I'm seeing this more and more, and it's really starting to piss me off. Like, don't bother saying what you're going to say if you need to put that asterisk at the end. And yeah, I see more and more people attaching asterisks to the end of what they have to say on the prequels. And it's because of fear. They're afraid the internet is going to attack them for it, but that shouldn't be the case, ever. It all comes down to what you say and how well you say it. But I think I've ranted enough on the matter. It's time to wrap this video up. Alrighty, you're all still here. I guess that means you've heeded my disclaimer at the beginning. Ordinarily, I would have finished this video up by now, but I have some more to say on a personal note regarding this video series, myself, and the general perception of this subject on the internet. So as you can tell, this video was much longer than my other episodes in this series, of which this makes 15 bloody episodes on the subject, which I expect to be referenced, by the way, whenever someone uses one of those slimy quotations I mentioned earlier to dismiss or weasel out of a discussion on the prequels, or if they want to paint the opposition as something they're not. This video was much longer because I really wanted to make a statement with this one. I'd like to think I took a much calmer and nuanced approach to this Revenge of the Prequels episode, because a great deal of comments I get are people who conflate my insults with my arguments, and just grasp at whatever straws they can to just ignore the meat of my videos, by painting a false picture of me and the side of the opposition which I stand on, which is shared by many, hundreds of thousands of people and likely millions as well, if this video and my series was anything to go by.
What are your opinions on Anomaly Inc., especially since he did a response to your video on the prequels? I don't have much of an opinion on the guy. I mean, I'm not going to act like I liked his video about me. It was there were parts of it that were pretty funny and pretty good. But he made a video response to a video I made called "Why People Don't Like the Prequels." In the entire video, he shits on me for not liking the prequels. And I'm like, dude, my rebuttal is the title alone. When within the first minute of the video, I say, these aren't all my opinions and I don't agree with all these. This is why most people don't like the prequels. And then he went on a rant. He was one of those guys where instead of actually articulating an argument in a debate, he's like, if I made a point, he'd be like, well, you don't get it because you're a stupid idiot, OT, purist, and suffer, like name calling. And I think he's older than me too, maybe twice my age.
Mate, you have got to be shitting me. While I can appreciate you found my response funny at times, if you truly thought I was being hostile, you obviously haven't checked out the vids I made on Marcus, also known as Cosmonaut Variety Hour. My response to you was essentially a light whipping, not a crucifixion. You had it easy, boy! Secondly, if my only argument was name-calling, then why exactly did you take the video down? Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of reasons to unlist or private or delete a video. Perhaps you never intended the video to be long-term, or perhaps you wanted them to be taken down because you were unsatisfied by its quality. I've done so myself for those very same reasons. But that video in question of yours was up for years. That was until I responded to it. And in the time it took me to upload part 2 of that episode of Revenge of the Prequels, that video of yours was mysteriously gone completely.
Coincidence? I think not!
But thankfully those episodes exist with the video in full context, so I guess we can leave it to the audience to infer what happened there. As you can see, the arguments for the prequels that countered the internet status quo that existed until 2015 certainly exist, and are numerous. Don't brush it off as nostalgia or insanity. Take the time to understand them, do your research, or just stop playing Chinese whispers on a topic that you have no vested interest in that propagates arguments you don't understand. I use insults in this series as dressing to mirror the shitty attitudes some pseudo-intellectuals on this site choose to approach this topic with. This is a topic that I happen to care about. So when I see well-established and respected personalities on this website vilify both the creation and the author on false grounds, and then I have to hear these things echoed throughout the internet by hordes of misinformed people who didn't actually watch the movies and didn't even listen to the personality making these arguments, I get extremely frustrated. That's why during the epilogue of my response, my tone changed to a harsher nature where I wanted to call out and respond to people's agendas and criticisms of myself and my series. I also wanted to address some of that criticism. I cannot begin to tell you how many times people have enlightened me with this exact quotation. I swear, all Anomaly does is, say stuff about the prequels. He never actually says why they're good. And yeah, I intentionally said that in the most insufferable voice possible because that's exactly what I hear now every time I have to read that fucking shit. Week in and week out for the past 18 months. And it's the very reason I took so long and went into such depth while I responded to WatchMojo. Because while I was responding to them, I was also addressing this very shallow criticism of myself. Well, there you go. If you watch this video and by the end all you have to say is, oh, you don't actually say why the prequels are good, then I'll stick you in the same category of narrow-minded jerk-offs that create an echo chamber for themselves and refuse to actually listen and opt to lazily paint the opposition because you can't string together a substantive fucking sentence, whether it be an argument against the prequels or a criticism of my work. Not to mention, I can happily reverse that remark and say, you just say stuff about the prequels, you don't actually say why they're bad. Or rather, I could say, you just say why you hate the prequels. You don't actually say why they're bad. And if I can be even more of a cunt to those people who say the prequels didn't suddenly become good because the sequels are bad, well, as we've no doubt established at this point, bullshit remarks along the lines of fuck Jar Jar doesn't translate to an objective flaw with the movies or the art of the prequels. So shut your fucking mouth. The purpose of this series is to deconstruct shitty argumentation against the Star Wars prequels. These are responses, they aren't critiques. They aren't love letters or praises. My job is to set the record straight. How I do that varies with each video because each response is different. Although many of you who have been following along will no doubt have recognized patterns by now with the opposition. And that's one of many points I've tried to make with this series. How the opposition is rarely original when it comes to the weird climate surrounding the prequels and how many of them just echo each other without saying anything new. But what certain people apparently turn their ears off for throughout these videos is when I do give praise. Because newsflash, in case your mind is divorced from reality or you're still stuck in your little George Lucas prequel hate bubble, by deconstructing the bad takes, you can provide good takes. By debunking shitty arguments against the art, you can provide great arguments in favor of the art. By cleansing the mountains of dog shit, you can reveal the treasure underneath. And that's exactly what this series is. And that's exactly what I do. There is no try. I don't want to hear any more bullshit regarding my work and my position on the matter. No doubt I will, but at least people can reference this going forward because quite frankly, I'm tired of having to deal with it. I love this topic, I love making these videos, but I've been at this since November of 2018, almost a year after I started my channel. And with this video, this makes 15 video responses. 15! In addition to all of my other videos, not to mention the live streams I've guested and hosted on the matter. My passion for the topic is still there and always will be, but my energy on the matter is very much waning. To be perfectly blunt, it feels like I've been banging my head against a brick wall for the past 18 months. And now I just want a breath of fresh air. That's why I'll be focusing on other videos after this one is published. The series isn't going anywhere, and I'll return to it at some point, but for the time being, Revenge of the Prequels after this video is published will be on hiatus. This is the other reason I wanted to make sure everyone stayed till the end of the video. Revenge of the Prequels is now my most requested content on this channel. I know I said in the very first episode that this was going to be a long-term endeavor, but truthfully, I didn't actually believe those words when I said them. In truth, I was just frustrated with the internet climate at the time and I wanted to let off some steam. But to my surprise, it's a form of content many of my channel loyalists at the time really enjoyed. So I keep making this content, not because I expected it to go anywhere, but because I wanted to give back to those people who stuck with me from the very beginning. Because of those people, I indulged in more and more research. I had many people reach out to me and educate me on misconceptions that I had on the topic. Misconceptions that the internet gave me in the first place that have now been replaced with facts and evidence, and it's because of you guys that the quality of this series has grown so much in the past 18 months. And now in present day, what was once just a passion series enjoyed by a few hundred of us has grown into something enjoyed by the tens of thousands, and it's been truly humbling. I want to say thank you to those people who have stuck with me since the beginning and those who've caught on to this series as it grew and helped to grow it into what it is today. I still see many insightful comments from people who help me where I stumble in both my videos and my live streams. And make no mistake, I absolutely take all of the comments to heart. I can't read them all, but the ones I do see, I take something from all of them. I am only one brain at the end of the day, and I will fuck up, but you guys will be there to correct me and provide your own insight, which I appreciate. I will make mistakes, I will fall short of the mark, and I simply cannot cover everything. That's why during this hiatus, I would like to see other people talk about this topic. I know there's many of you out there. This series is living proof of that. So if you have something to say, just say it. Make a video and share it with the world. Don't be shy about it either. Lord knows we aren't short of pussies on the internet. But for example, take someone like Rick Worley, the guy who had less than 200 subscribers. He made a 2-hour video. Script, editing, the whole nine. This 2-hour video unapologetically praising George Lucas and the prequels, whilst also calling out highly established channels with rabid fan bases on YouTube. I came across it out of nowhere. The title discouraged me at first, but I still clicked on it, and it was one of the most insightful videos I've ever seen. Did Rick get hounded and badgered by angry fans who didn't like what he said? Absolutely! Did he get way more praise and views for that video than the hate he got for it? Yes, he fucking did. Because he knew what he was talking about. He had the facts. He had the insight. And he had the passion. So many people have come up to me and told me they used to get chastised for openly liking the prequels until they had a leg to stand on, and that leg to stand on is this very series you are watching. To those people and others as well, I say this: if you have something to say about a piece of art, whether it be a book, a movie, a video game, television show, or whatever, if you have something to say, have the balls to fucking say it. Just make sure you know what the fuck you're talking about. If you have the passion, you will do the research. If you do the research, you'll have the facts. If you have the facts, you can say whatever the fuck you want. Popularity be damned. Unless, of course, your free speech is violated unjustly by YouTube or Twitter, but the point stands. If you have the facts, you don't have to be scared of what you put out there. People will hate what they don't like. They'll ridicule you. They'll try to bring you down. But you have the facts, and they can go fuck themselves with those facts. While this series is on hiatus, I'd like to see people speak their mind on this topic. As long as they're honest, concise, factual, and back up what they say, I'll listen, and I'll support. And if you can back up what you say, you won't hear from me. And that brings this long video to a close. Thank you all so much for sticking with it till the very end. If you've come this far, consider staying for the outro. Firstly, go and subscribe to Rick Worley's channel and check out this video I mentioned previously. You won't regret it. You will reach the end of that video having learnt a hell of a lot. I can guarantee that much. Now, this doesn't mean you will agree with everything that is said, but you will no doubt find the video informative and you will certainly enjoy it. I make you that solemn promise. Secondly, at the risk of being a broken record, this is the latest video in a series of 15 at present. So if you're new to the series, be sure to go back and start from the beginning. It'll be a neat experience to watch them in order, and you'll see how the argumentation has progressed over time. Thirdly, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to all of my patrons. You guys are amazing and I appreciate your support. Very, very much. If you'd like to support me with a monthly donation, even if it's just $1 per month, the link to Patreon is in the description. Also, I'd like to thank my YouTube members as well. Thank you to the Star Killers, the Captain Prizes, and the Master Chiefs for your support as well. I appreciate it. Also, in addition to everything else I'm working on, I have a second channel called AI Gaming, so be sure to check that out if you're up for any gaming content. I just released a lengthy retrospective review on Star Wars Battlefront 2 EA, which I'm quite happy about, so be sure to check out the channel, and perhaps you'll find something to your liking. Also, believe it or not, there's official Revenge of the Prequels merchandise that can be found at the channel's online store. Wear your colors proud while supporting me at the same time. I hope you check it out. No doubt you guys noticed a new avatar and intro for the channel, and I want to give a quick thank you to Maverick from the Discord for designing the avatar, and to Grant Harper for designing the new intro. Grant does some great stop motion work on his channel, be sure to check him out, I've linked it below. Also, a special thank you to the Senate, a private channel on my Discord who acted as the test audience while this video was being developed. Thank you to Coolman229, The Real Wise Wolf, AngelRin89, The Token Female, and Metal Gear Mando. Your assistance, time, and criticism was invaluable to this video, so thank you. Now finally, if you'd like to contact me, you can reach me on Twitter, or preferably you can contact me on the channel's Discord server. What Discord basically is an online community where other followers of this channel congregate to talk about a range of different topics, ranging from Star Wars to video games, anime, and so on. So I hope to see you there, and chances are you'll make some friends along the way. Now with all that said, here's one more thank you for staying till the end of the video. You are a legend, and I'll see you next time.
The main thing is to protect these characters. Make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them.
I sold them to the white slavers.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since...
Share your energy with me! Spirit box meeting!
great.